Good evening, my friend. Tonight we are stepping into one of the oldest and most powerful mythologies ever told. A world shaped by ice and fire, by gods, giants, shadows, and storms. A world where the very sky above us was said to be carved from the skull of a giant. This is the beginning of Norse mythology, a story that starts in total emptiness. No sky, no land, no time, and ends in the burning twilight of Ragnarok. As we walk through it together, we will meet Odin, the wanderer who gave up his own eye for wisdom, Thor, the protector with his thunder hammer, and Loki, the unpredictable trickster who caused trouble but was strangely always needed. We'll travel across all 9 worlds, Asgard, Midgard, the deep roots of Yggdrasil, and even the cold halls of Hel. And slowly, piece by piece, you'll see how the Norse imagined the beginning of everything and its end. But for now, let's go back to where it all started. Before the first sunrise, before even the idea of today or yesterday, there was only one thing, Ginnungagap, the great empty space. To the north of this emptiness was Niflheim, a world of ice, dark mist, and endless cold. Here, the ancient spring Virgilmere sent out 12 rivers of freezing water called the Iliviga. To the south burned Muspelheim, a realm of roaring fire watched over by the fire giant Surtur. These 2 worlds, ice and flame, were complete opposites, but where their breaths met in the middle of Ginnungagap, something unbelievable happened. The frost from Niflheim began to melt when touched by the warm wind of Muspelheim. Drop by drop, that melting ice created life. From those melting droplets, a giant came into being. Huge, heavy, and ancient, sleepy with old strength. His name was Ymir, though some called him Orgelmir. Ymir wasn't a god. He belonged to the race that would one day challenge the gods, the frost giants. And the way giants multiplied in the beginning, it wasn't graceful, it wasn't romantic, it simply happened. While Ymir slept, a man and a woman grew from the sweat of his armpits, and from the joining of his own feet came another son. This was a world where life wasn't planned. It simply pushed itself forward, wild and unshaped, in a universe that had barely figured out how to exist. But the melting frost did not only create Ymir. A gentler creature appeared. The great cosmic cow Audhumla. Her body shined with frost, and 4 rivers of sweet, warm milk flowed from her, keeping Ymir alive. She too needed nourishment, so she began licking the salty ice around her, slowly and patiently. On the first day of licking, a single hair appeared. On the second day, a head. On the third day, an entire man stepped out of the ice, tall, proud, noble. This was Beri, the first of the gods. Beri fathered a son named Bor, who married the giantess Bisla, daughter of Bolthorn, whose name fittingly means evil thorn. From their unlikely union came 3 sons who would change everything, Odin, Vili, V. These brothers brought something new into the world: intention, creativity, intelligence, the power to shape things on purpose. Norse mythology is honest about one thing: the world was never simple. The first cow isn't a goddess. The first giant isn't purely evil. The gods themselves are born from both divine and giant blood. This universe is a shared home from the very beginning, children of frost living beside children of fire. That is why conflict feels inevitable in these stories. Everyone is connected, even enemies. Meanwhile, Ymir kept creating more giants, and with each generation, the danger grew. He wasn't evil, he was simply massive, unpredictable, and powerful enough to crush the world by accident. The young gods watched all of this quietly, and they realized something important: a world without order cannot survive. A power that is never used becomes a waste. The brothers, Odin, Vili, and Vi, decided to act. They confronted Ymir, not out of hatred, but because the world could not take shape while he filled all of creation. When they struck him down, his fall broke the silence that had ruled Ginnungagap since the dawn. His blood poured out in enormous floods, becoming the oceans. Almost all the giants drowned, except one. Bergilmir, who escaped in a wooden chest with his wife. From that couple, all future giants descended. So even after the first battle, the rivalry between gods and giants remained. Then the gods began shaping the world from Ymir's body. Flesh became the land, bones became the mountain's teeth, and jaw became cliffs. His skull became the sky. The gods lifted that giant skull high into the air and set 4 dwarfs to support it at its 4 corners. Their names became the 4 directions: north, south, east, and west. From sparks of Muspelheim they created stars, and from Ymir's drifting brain they formed clouds. Even the weather, they said, was the slow thought of a dead giant. The gods didn't just create beauty, they created structure. They placed Sol, a radiant young woman, in a chariot to guide the sun across the sky. 2 horses, Arvakr and Alsvidr, pulled it. A great shield rode in front to protect the world from burning. They set Mani, keeper of the moon, on his own path. He carried 2 children, Bil and Juki, who he had rescued from a well on a cold night. To explain eclipses and the constant motion of the heavens, the Norse imagined that 2 wolves, Skurll and Hati, chased the sun and moon each day. One day they will catch them, but not yet. Night and day themselves were given personalities. Night was a woman named Not, who rode the horse Hrimfaxi. The dew on the grass came from the foam at its mouth. Day was her son, riding Skinfaxi, whose bright mane lit the morning sky. And so the first rhythm of life began. The gods built a safe place for humans by shaping a great enclosure from Ymir's eyebrows. They called it Midgard, the middle world. Outside of it lay Jotunheim, the land of giants. Between them stood thick forests filled with danger, a reminder that the line between friend and enemy was thin and drawn only out of survival. Later, the gods would build the rainbow bridge Bifrost to connect Midgard to their own realm, Asgard. But for now, the sea and the wall of eyebrows were the first borders of the human world. From the decaying flesh of Ymir came crawling creatures. The gods shaped these into dwarfs, small, sharp-minded beings who lived deep underground. In time, these dwarfs would forge the greatest treasures of the gods. But for now, they held up the sky, worked in the dark, and learned the crafts that would bind the world together. Once the heavens and the land were ready, the gods turned their attention to something new. On the beach, they found 2 pieces of driftwood, one ash, one elm, smooth and worn by the sea. From these, they carved the first man and the first woman. Ask and Embla, Odin breathed life into them. Vili gave them thought and understanding. Vi gave them shape, voice, and senses. The gods placed them inside Midgard, where they would build homes, form families, and fill the world with generations to come. Oh, help these new humans survive. The gods set the paths of the sun and moon so seasons could flow. They taught men how to count nights, watch the moon, and understand the returning tilt of the sun. They even imagined summer and winter as living beings, each with their own temper and story. And so, from chaos, the world finally had rhythm, warmth, cold, and time, and life, in all its forms, could begin to grow. The world the gods had shaped was not perfectly neat or completely safe. It rested in a fragile balance, caught between memories that held it together and forgetfulness that could make it fall apart. The gods understood this, so they placed watchers in the right places and let certain beings settle where they were needed. Fresh wells began forming beneath the roots that would soon earn names. High above, the empty air welcomed wings. In the hidden soil below, something old began to stir. An eagle claimed the highest place in the sky, watching creation from a view no one else could match. Deep in the shadows under the earth, something ancient gnawed at the roots. And racing up and down the great tree, a small squirrel carried messages, most of them petty insults, between the high branches and the dark roots. The old storytellers loved adding that detail because it reminded listeners that even in a world the gods had carefully shaped, gossip still existed. And gossip, like tiny teeth on bark, always leaves marks. This was the point of such details. The gods did not try to erase the strange or the wild. They simply gave it a place to belong. As they continued walking through their new world, they began giving names to everything they saw. They named the morning and the evening, the midday and the midnight, the passing of weeks and years, the fields and the streams. For them, naming was not decoration. A name tied something to meaning. A name honored it. Once spoken, the word settled like a net across the land. Under that net, people could remember, could plant, could measure time, could keep promises. Bit by bit, the three brothers transformed raw matter into a world that truly breathed. They didn't create out of nothing. They shaped what already existed. They cut and measured. They held back and allowed space. They turned a giant's corpse into a landscape, a skull into the sky above, and leftover breath into living people. But even as they worked, they understood the world would need more than force. It would need attention. It would need discipline. Because giants still lived beyond the walls, and wolves already prowled near the edges of the sky. Even so, for the first time, there was a place where humans could stand, and a way for them to keep track of days and seasons. Everything in this new world revolved around a mighty ash tree whose branches touched the highest sky and whose roots drank from the oldest waters. The poets called it Yggdrasil. It was not just a tree, but the very axis that held creation together. 9 realms clung to it, like bees clustering around a branch. It was not just a symbol. It was a home for creatures, a road for travelers, a storehouse of stories, and a drum that carried the rhythm of fate. And when the tree trembled, destiny trembled with it. When it flourished, the world stood steady. 3 roots held the tree firm, each reaching into a different part of existence and drinking from a different well. 1 root reached the realm where the gods met in council. Beside this root sat the Norns, 3 powerful women who guarded the well of fate. Their names meant what has been, what is becoming, and what must still come. They didn't weave fate on a innate loom like later stories imagined. They carved into wood. They cut into living bark. They mixed water with shining white clay and painted the trunk to keep it from splitting. The ground around them was always green, nourished by their daily blessings. Nothing the gods promised could stand unless these 3 allowed it to be carved into the grain of the world tree. Another root stretched outward toward the land of stone and frost, where the giants held their councils. Beneath this root lay the well of Mimir, a dark pool that contained every important thought the world had ever produced. Odin once traveled there and paid for a drink with his eye. That alone shows how valuable that knowledge was. Later stories say he preserved Mimir's head with herbs and spells, so he could continue asking it questions. But the head itself was only a small part of the deeper wisdom inside the well. When Odin looked into those waters, he saw not comfort but truth. truth harsh enough to show him what it meant to hold the center of the world steady. The third root descended into a realm of thick mist where cold streams were born. Here lay the well of Virgilmere, boiling and smoking in the dimness. Around it slithered many slow, patient snakes. The greatest among them was Nidhogg, who chewed at the root without ever stopping. He wasn't just a monster. He represented the necessary hunger of endings, the truth that even sacred things can decay. From this deep root flowed the waters that fed the first rivers. From those rivers came fog, rain, and the morning dew that gathered on grass. Some poems called the drops that fell from the branches honeydew, food for bees, sweetness born from high places, balanced against the acid bite from below. Growth and rot worked side by side. Yggdrasil was alive with more than gods and giants. At its highest branch perched an eagle that saw farther than any creature. Between its eyes sat a hawk named Vedafalnir, as if even the sky needed its own watchman. On the bark scampered the squirrel Ratatosk, carrying sharp words between root and crown, leaving scratches on every path he ran. 4 great stags wandered through the branches, nibbling leaves with quiet hunger, their names echoing in old poems. Beneath, a nest of serpents worked tirelessly at the roots. The tree was always being fed and always being wounded, one of the truths the poets insisted people should not forget. Each day, the gods rode out to the first root to judge disputes and settle matters. Old verses listed their horses, each with ringing names. Thor chose to cross the rivers on foot instead of riding the rainbow bridge, partly to avoid breaking it under his thunderous weight. The gods kept schedules. They kept order. They sat beneath the tree's shade like people sit beneath a courthouse roof, letting the living branches witness their decisions. Law in their world was not cold or distant, it was part of the living world. High above, the crown of Yggdrasil caught the ancient light that first fell from Muspelheim. The leaves grew in layers, almost like crafted architecture. Some poems spoke of a stag named Ixionir, who stood on Odin's hall and nibbled at a tree called Leirather, from whose antlers water dripped down into Virgilmere. Scholars wondered if Leirather was another name for Yggdrasil or a different tree nearby, but for the myths, the meaning was simple. Everything in the heavens completed a cycle. What was eaten above became water below. What was drunk at the roots rose again as sap and leaf. The tree was a road as well. Travelers climbed or descended along its hidden paths. Odin rode his 8-legged horse along unseen routes. Valkyries carried fallen warriors through branches that felt like wind. Dwarfs measured their homes by how close they were to the nearest root. Elves settled where the filtered light through its crown glowed like pearls. Giants tested its strength whenever they challenged borders. Every crossing of a boundary in Norse myth was a crossing of bark. The health of Yggdrasil mattered to everyone. When it flourished, fields were fertile, families grew, and ships returned safely. When beetles chewed its bark, when snakes gnawed too quickly, when drought prevented the Norns from tending it properly, the world felt the change, poor harvests, sick animals, and uneasy nights. The poets described it simply. The ash-great tree groaned, and even the gods could not pretend they didn't hear. One day, far in the future, it would shake hard enough for everyone to understand the warning, but not yet. The Norns still sprinkled the white water. The gods still came to sit beneath its shade. Balance still held. The name Yggdrasil held its own story. It meant the steed of the terrible one, using an old name for Odin, Igga, meaning the fearful or the awe-inspiring. Drasil meant horse. The name remembered the terrible moment when Odin hung upon the tree for 9 nights to learn the runes. In those nights, the tree became a mount that carried him beyond himself. The runes he won were not simple letters. They were tiny agreements with the world tree, symbols that asked wood and water to behave for a short time. The lessons wrapped inside the tree were not decorative. They were doctrine. The center of the universe was not a shining throne, but a living plant that needed care. Fate was not a mindless wheel, but 3 women who tended bark and time. Evil was not a cartoonish monster, but an ancient dragon that chewed because that was its nature. Hope was not a slogan, but water taken from a clear well and poured back onto the same old trunk every morning. In these patterns, people saw their own work: tend what sustains you, name what you take responsibility for, and accept that part of living is constantly repairing what wears down. So Yggdrasil stood, an ash tree so vast that all the 9 realms took their bearings from its roots and branches. The rainbow bridge touched one of its limbs. The halls of gods, the caverns of dwarfs, and the fields of humans all looked toward it when they spoke of a center. Soon, the story would step off the branches and explore the realms one by one. But the tree had to be understood first, because every journey in Norse myth was, in one way or another, a journey along its wood. The map of the Norse world wasn't a neat stack of heavens above and underworlds below. It was a living arrangement built into and around this great ash. Poets spoke of 9 realms, but always left room for mystery. Paths twisted. Borders drifted. And what mattered most was how each realm related to the next. Together, they formed a universe that honored courage, demanded oaths, and remembered every debt. High in the shining upper world stood Asgard, where the air was sharp and the ground rang beneath iron-shod hooves. This was the stronghold of the gods, the place where law, war, and poetry shared the same table. On the field of Idavol, the gods held their meetings. There stood Gladsheim, the hall of judgment, and Valaskjalf with its silver roof, where Odin watched the worlds from his high seat. Valhalla rose nearby with its hundreds of doors and rafters of spears, a hall where chosen warriors spent their days training, and their nights feasting beneath shields that glowed like fish scales. At the foot of the rainbow bridge, Heimdall kept watch, his hearing so sharp he could hear grass growing or wool thickening on a sheep. Asgard wasn't a place of rest. It was a place preparing for the future. High above the world, at the same height as Asgard but in another direction, lies a gentler land. This is Vanaheim, home of the Vanir, gods of the sea's rolling swell, of rich soil, and of wise agreements. Long ago, after the first great war between the gods, the Aesir and the Vanir made peace and became kin. That truce was not just a line in a story, it was written into the very shape of the world. By the sea, Njord keeps to the shoreline in his hall of Notun, where the sound of oars against water and the smell of tar and salt never leave the air. His son Freyr, lord of good weather and rich harvests, moves easily between Asgard and Vanaheim, a bridge of goodwill in the shape of a god. Freyja, his sister, brings with her the magic of Seidr and welcomes the honored dead in the wide field called Folkvanga, where some of the fallen come not to Odin's hall, but to hers. Vanaheim is a place that grows more than it shouts. Its strength is quiet, patient, generous. Power there is kept not by iron and shouting, but by gifts, fairness, and the steady honoring of promises. In another shining corner of the upper world lies Alfheim, a realm so bright it seems as if the light does not just fall from the sky, but glows from the leaves themselves. This is the home of the light elves, beings said to be more beautiful than the sun to look upon. They are quick with music and skilled at shaping what lives, plants, wood, growing things, rather than hammering metal or carving stone. Old verses say that Ulfheim was given to Freya as a gift when he first came of age, the way a child might receive a meaningful present. It was a sign that gentle growth and prosperity should have a place at the gods' table. In stories where humans meet elves, there is always a hush, as if the very air is bowing. Ulfheim quietly teaches that beauty is not an extra, not something added last. It is a responsibility. Grace itself behaves like a law. In the middle of everything lies Midgard, the home of human beings. Its walls were first made from the eyebrows of the primal giant, and its outer boundary is the great ocean that poured from his blood. People live here, and their lives are short and earnest, full of effort and worry and love. Around the edge of this human world, the great serpent Jormungandr coils with his tail in his mouth, a living belt that both protects and threatens. His presence reminds everyone that danger and safety often lie in the same place. In Midgard, people learn measurement. They look up at night to count the passing hours by the calm face of the moon, and by day they follow the sure walk of the sun across the sky. They look outward toward the fields to read the weather and decide when to sow seeds and when to harvest. They look inward to remember their promises, because law without memory is just noise in the air. The gods visit Midgard often, not only to bless and help, but also to test whether humans are still worth the effort of walls, bridges, and protection. Beyond the familiar lands in harsher air stretches Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. Its mountains are cold and sharp, and its rivers run like bands of iron. Giants live there not as clumsy fools, but as old powers with ancient rights. Some are rough and dangerous, like storms crashing against cliffs. Some are striking and serious. Many are wise. Fortress halls such as Utgard stand in this land, ruled by giant kings who use riddles and illusions sharp enough to humble even Thor. The border between Midgard and Jotunheim is more than physical. It marks the difference between settled speech and the wild tongue of rocks, wind, and winter. But the boundary is also made of kinship. Frigg counts a giantess among her closest companions, and Skadi, a giant's daughter and fierce huntress, marries into the gods and keeps her bow even in marriage. Jotunheim is the necessary opponent. Without it, bravery would have nowhere to prove itself, and clever minds would grow blunt. Far below the surface lies Nidavellir, which some call Svartalfheim. Caverns twist and branch, they're like unseen roots of the world tree. In these deep halls, the dwarfs keep their forges burning. They are masters at binding fire into shape, turning heat and metal into tools and treasures. Their memory for agreements and promises is long, longer than winter nights. Old poems recite their names like sparks flying from an anvil. From their workshops come rings that drip gold, ships that can be folded and carried like cloth, shining boars whose bristles glow, and a hammer that always returns to the hand that throws it. Some say the dark elves are the same as the dwarfs, others say they are their neighbors. The poems refuse to settle the argument, and perhaps that is fitting. What is certain is that this realm holds the knowledge of patience and tempering. Nothing good is made quickly here. Everything worth keeping must be heated, shaped, cooled, and shaped again. In the far deep cold rests Niflheim, brooding under heavy air where breath steams and sound does not travel far. From the well called Virgilmere rise many bitter rivers whose names sound like curses. They creep outward beneath Remice until they spill off the edge of the world, glittering like falling knives. Swarms of snakes move in that region, led by Nidhogg, the old devourer, who gnaws at the roots of the ash and reminds all creatures that even beginnings will one day rot. Niflheim is not evil in the sense of sharp hatred. It is persistence, calculation, and a chill that cannot be charmed away. It is the part of the world that says, do not forget that everything can wear down. In the opposite direction burns Muspelheim. Here the air moves like hot breath, and sparks rise in flocks, like birds made of fire. At its border stands Surtur with his flaming sword, bright enough to burn right through to bone. The first stars in the heavens were once sparks from this land, taken and set into the dome of the sky. Muspelheim teaches that fire is tool and judge at once. It gives light so calendars can be kept and journeys counted, but it also burns away anything built without care. Muspelheim does not argue, does not bargain, and does not forget. Down a hard and lonely road, past a golden bridge, lies Hel, also called Helheim. One day, the god Hermod will ride this road carrying news, and he will come back with a condition that cannot quite be filled. This realm takes its name from its queen, a daughter of Loki, half lovely and half corpse-pale. She receives those who did not die in glory, those who did not fall in battle with sword in hand or shield overhead. Her hall is called Eldjidnir. Hunger is the dish on its plate. Famine is the edge of its knife. The threshold is a drop that stills the heart. The river Gijol flows there, and above it arches the bridge Gijalabru, glowing faintly with a light that gives no warmth. A maiden named Modgud guards the crossing, and her questions are as sharp as spears. At the cave of Nipperhelia, the hound Garm lifts his head and bays whenever he scents the dead. On the shore called Nastrond stand houses built from the spines of the treacherous. Venom drips from their roofs, and the floors are unfit to lie upon. Yet most who come to hell are not monsters or cowards. They are ordinary people who simply died in their beds or on the road. They live in shadows and remember the taste of air. The realm is heavy, quiet, and sad rather than full of rage. These 9 realms are not stacked neatly like floors in a tower. They weave through the branches and roots of Yggdrasil and touch at edges that shift with mood, story, and season. Paths run between them. The rainbow bridge, Bifrost, shines between Asgard and Midgard, bright as wet silk, strong enough for daily travel but not for Thor's full charge, which is why he often prefers to wade the rivers on foot. Mountain passes laid from human fields into giant lands, where the wind bites the lungs like a small knife. Old wells and hidden doorways sometimes open on special nights, letting someone step out of a forest and into a hall of antler-masked hosts. Dwarfs who value written agreements refuse to travel without safe conducts carved with runes. Elves ask no coin, but demand flawless courtesy instead. The gods themselves follow routines. Each morning they ride from Asgard to sit beside the roots of the world tree and give judgments that apply to all realms. When they travel farther, they sometimes wear other names and test the kindness, or at least the honesty, of those who host them. Over all of this move the great rhythms that pull every realm into the same long dance. Day follows night without missing a step. The sun and moon continue their paths with their wolves close behind, sometimes nearer, never quite catching them. While the world is still young, winds climb up from cold seas and return with salt on their breath. The ocean rises and falls in a habit learned long ago, when a drinking horn once meant something more. Snow gathers in the north. Warm rains fall in the south. The ash drinks with its roots and breathes with its leaves. The realms do not simply sit side by side, they live through one another. That is why a story can move from a small farm to a giant's hall without apology. Those places have always been neighbors. Balance here does not mean quiet or softness. It does not mean peace at any cost. It means that each part of the world plays its role faithfully. The gods hold the center by keeping their oaths and paying the price for wisdom. The giants hold the edges by pushing back against anything claimed as final. Humans tend their homes by honoring what they owe to guests, family, and neighbors. Dwarfs shape tools and treasures that lock intentions into metal and craft. Elves quietly insist that light and beauty must fall on what is made, or it will not be worth keeping. Cold demands thrift. Fire demands discipline. Death demands truth. When each of these receives its due, the worlds hold together. When one is ignored, the tree groans. This is how the map works in practice. It explains why a fisherman in Midgard thanks a god in Asgard for a fair wind that blows in from Vanaheim, and why he leaves a small coin on a stone because, once long ago, a dwarf mended the clasp on his net. It explains why a poet looks up at the night sky and feels that it is full of presence, not empty space, and why an old woman whispers a short charm at her doorway as if the wood itself can listen. In such a world, nothing exists alone. Every realm lends something to the others, and every debt will eventually come due. In the youth of these worlds, when the sap of Yggdrasil still shone fresh on the bark, and the rainbow bridge gleamed with the brightness of new rain, trouble came to the high field of the gods. It did not arrive with a battle cry or the thunder of hooves. It came quietly in the footsteps of a woman whose name the poet splits like a beam of light through glass. Some called her Gullveig, gold drunk. Others called her Hyde, bright one, the one who speaks in glittering words. She walked into the hall of the Aesir with a secret smile and a power they both wanted and feared. Her craft was Sather, a kind of magic made of threads and spirits, of seeing what is about to ripen and coaxing it into fullness, of tugging gently at the winds that pass through human luck. It was not the clean, open magic of battlefield songs and carved runes. It was a house magic and a border magic, more at home in quiet rooms and crossroads than on open fields. And it obeyed a will that did not always favor straight lines or drawn swords. At first, the gods were enchanted. Asgard glittered as if some invisible hand had polished it. Wealth came quickly. Purses filled faster than seemed reasonable. Words gained new edges and could be made to land softly or cut deep without a shout. The gods believed they had mastered this new power. For a brief time, they were simply its delighted students. Then they saw the cost. Sather required someone to sit apart, to sink into a trance that made them look vulnerable, unguarded, almost weak. It asked the strong to accept a posture they despised. It asked that value be found in strange places, that desires be spoken aloud without armor. The Aesir were people of law, spear, and measured songs. They decided that this art was beneath them, even as they realized they could not quite stop using it. The old poem of the wise woman says they chose the simplest solution. They threw spears at her. They burned her in their own hall. They did it 3 times, to be sure. Each time she stood up again from the ashes, smiling as if nothing had been taken from her at all. In these tales, names are not just labels but states of being. When she is Gullveig, then it is gold itself that speaks. When she is Hyde, it is shining speech that refuses to die. The gods learned something hard that day. Some forces cannot be destroyed just because you are uncomfortable with them. They can only be balanced by another force, just as strong and bound by law. The Vanir were the ones who had first taught her arts and called her kin. They were old neighbors of the Aesir, guardians of fertile fields and fair winds, skilled in making peace and bargains. When they heard that the Aesir had tried to burn their seeress, their anger was cold and complete. They did not send a messenger to debate terms. They prepared for battle. The first spear cast in anger flew like a sudden change of weather, and with that, the first war of the gods began. No one wrote down a neat list of battles from that first war of the gods. There are no dates, no banners carefully described, no roll call of who stood where. What we have instead are the marks the war left on the world itself. The walls around the high field of the gods shook and cracked. Stones slid. Great spears lay scattered afterward like reeds flattened by a flood. In the old songs, people say the Aesir were fierce in open battle, and the Vanir were subtle and clever in their answers. The Aesir rushed forward with war cries and magic songs that hardened the heart and sharpened every blade. The Vanir answered with workings that softened iron, dulled edges, and sent confusion through the enemy ranks without a single visible strike. It was never a war between courage and fear. It was a clash between two different ways of protecting what matters. The Aesir guarded order with oaths and iron. The Vanir protected growth with gifts and craft. Neither could force the other to kneel. The seasons still did their work. Summer came as it always did. Winter followed as it always had. But inside those seasons, something had gone wrong. Grain failed in fields that had never known hunger. In other places, crops grew in strange, wild abundance, more than anyone knew what to do with. The ocean currents shifted. Fishermen who had always pulled up heavy nets sometimes found them overflowing, and then in the next moon drew them up again only to find froth and empty mesh. The war in the high places had reached down into the small places. It had touched the spirits of field and sea. People felt it in their bread, in the tightness of their belts, and in the weight of their nets. When people asked the storytellers why this was happening, the answer they got was not comforting, but it was honest. The gods cannot harm one another without that harm running down into the stems of wheat and the bones of fish. When high things fight, low things pay. At last, the Aesir called for a meeting. The Vanir agreed. They chose a plain between their lands, open and flat, with nowhere to hide, because even gods do not like to risk an ambush when they are trying to talk about honor. There they laid down their weapons and spoke without shouting. The Aesir admitted that they could not erase Seithr from the world. They could not pretend that desire and luck were not part of how things worked. The Vanir admitted that fields, wombs and winds all needed more than gentle tending. They needed strong houses that could stand in storms, and courts that could turn jealousy and anger into fair judgment. Each side could list the faults of the other. Each side also knew it could not live without what the other brought. So they chose peace. Peace between gods is not a casual handshake and a few polite words. It has to be made real. Both sides stepped up to a great vessel and spat into it. They did it on purpose. Spit is personal. You cannot fake it. It carries breath, food, and the truth of the body that made it. All that mingled spittle was gathered up and shaped into a single being. From the vat rose a man, tall and calm-faced. They named him Kvasir. He walked among both families of gods and spoke in a way that smoothed tangled thoughts. He never seemed lost for an answer, not because he loved the sound of his own voice, but because he knew how to ask questions, and because he understood that no one view contains the whole truth. His very existence was a sign. Real peace begins when the words of one side can live comfortably in the mouth of the other. To seal the promise further, the gods exchanged what they called hostages, though they were not prisoners. They were honored guests, promised to live as kin. From Vanaheim came Njord, who understood coastlines, trade, shifting sandbars, and the slow moods of the sea. With him came his children, Freya and Freyja. Freya brought warm weather, good harvests, and the quiet luck of fair bargains. Freyja brought the deepest mastery of Seidr ever entrusted to a friend of the Aesir. From Asgard went Honir, a leader with noble bearing, whose first rulings were sharp and satisfying, and Mimir, keeper of a mind full of deep, old counsel. And for a while this exchange worked beautifully. In Asgard, the presence of the Vanir made the fields richer. Marriages were happier. Freya's laughter seemed to call ships safely home to harbour. And Freyja, who no longer hid her art, taught the craft of Seidr openly in a hall she built, a place that could stretch to fit everyone who came to it seeking real comfort. In Vanaheim, the bold sword songs of the Aesir were admired, and their habit of quick decision appealed to people who sometimes spent too long weighing the fine shades of every agreement. Honir sat in the high seat and seemed wise, especially when Mimir was at his side, quietly offering suggestions. When Mimir's quiet voice was there to guide him, Honir spoke like a man who had slept well, thought deeply, and understood what must be done. If the story ended there, it would be a smooth tale of peace. It doesn't. The Vanir began to notice a pattern. Whenever Mimir was sent away on an errand and Honir was left to judge alone, something changed. Faced with disputes, Honir would look at the rafters or at the knots in the table and say the matter should be decided by someone else. He stalled. He dodged. Without Mimir, the sure, quick wisdom was gone. The Vanir are patient and clever, but they are not foolish. They began to suspect they had been insulted, that they had been given a fine-looking leader who could not pull his weight unless his quiet advisor stood beside him, whispering in his ear. They felt like someone had gifted them a beautiful horse that would only move if its groom walked right at its shoulder. So they did something terrible and unforgettable. They cut off Mimir's head and sent it back to Asgard in a sack. In Asgard, grief did not explode in raving screams or wild destruction. It became work. Odin took the head into his hands and refused to let it fall silent. He washed it in herbs that held back rot. He spoke spells over it to keep its voice from fading. He placed it in a place of honor and asked it questions, as a king asks his steadiest friend. Mimir answered as he always had, with measured counsel and clear vision. The head did not decay. It continued to advise. From that time on, the Council of Asgard had a counselor who needed no chair, and the price of peace was marked in a way no one could ever forget. These stories never stop reminding us. Wisdom is expensive, and keeping what truly matters often requires care that looks harsh to softer hearts. Mimir's death ended the experiment of Honir ruling Vanaheim. The Vanir did not demand another chief. Instead, they let their anger go and accepted that the debt had been paid in full. The exchange still held now by Njord and his children living among the Aesir, and by a new, shared understanding between both sides. Kvasir continued to wander the roads as a living treaty with legs and a voice. The old tales say that later two dwarfs would kill him and turn his blood into a magical maid that grants poetry and skilled speech, and that Odin would eventually steal that drink for gods and humans alike. That theft belongs to another chapter. For now, what matters is this: peace was made, and the proof of that peace walked the world in the shape of a mild-faced man who could answer any riddle. The lessons of this war are not flattering to anyone. The Aesir misjudged a kind of power simply because it made them uncomfortable. The Vanir answered what they saw as deceit with an act that could never be undone. To find balance, each side had to accept what the other did best. Because of that, ships found better winds, courts found surer words, and eyes learned to respect a kind of magic that works quietly, through patience and careful attention. The Vanir accepted the need for strong walls that can hold when winter bites and hunger starts eyeing other people's grain. The Aesir accepted that strength without growth will starve, and growth without strength will rot. The poets like to leave us with a quieter picture after the formal parts of the story. They show the gods sitting together on Idavol, under the branches of the ash. This time there is no shouting, no debate that feels like sharpened steel. Odin's single eye is steady. Freyja's necklace, Brisingamen, catches a shard of sunlight. Njord talks about a sandbar that changes shape with every storm. Frigg asks a question and is answered with words that are both tender and practical. Thor, after too much meat and too many cups, snores politely in a corner while Tyr keeps an eye on the door and smiles now and then. Someone asks a riddle. Kvasir laughs before he answers. That laugh is the sound that remains after a war that nobody truly won. The war did not end with a dramatic trumpet blast or a final heroic charge. It ended with clarity, cold and clean as a north wind, that neither side could stand alone. The Aesir brought iron law, binding oath, and proud songs that steady courage. The Vanir brought growth, fair weather, and a long patience that helps both fields and people prosper. They walked out onto the bare ground between their realms, set their weapons aside, and chose to bind peace in a way that could not be faked. They spat into a shared vessel, mingling breath and food and the honesty of mouths that cannot lie to themselves. From that mingled spit they called forth Kvasir. He was calm. His eyes were bright. He settled quarrels without ever touching a sword. He never lacked an answer, not because he talked too much, but because he understood the natural grain of things and spoke along with it, not against it. He belonged to both families and to neither alone, the perfect place for a keeper of peace. He walked roads that ran through the halls of gods and the simple houses of humans. He sat by dim hearths on plain benches and showed a farmer how to divide a field so that each half helped the other grow. He visited dwarf forges and asked about iron, why some metal rings clear and true and another snaps and sulks. He explained the difference between a riddle meant to sharpen the mind and a trick meant only to humiliate. He spoke in ways that made people better at what they already did, and he never mocked those who were slow to understand. And so, after the first war of the gods, the world settled, for a time, into a new kind of balance, one built not only on power, but on the hard-won agreement that no strength is complete on its own. Kvasir didn't just answer questions, he helped people think. He waited patiently while others searched for the right words, and when they finally found them, he praised the answer as if it were not tied well and tight. Among the old poets, the highest compliment you could give was to say that someone speaks with Kvasir's mouth. In the oldest stories, his fate turns dark. Two dwarfs will one day kill him and brew a magical mead from his blood, a drink that gives poetry and learning. But that lies in the future. For now, he is alive, and the peace between the gods walks the world in his footsteps. The agreement between the two families of gods didn't just end a war, it changed how Asgard worked. The magic of Seidr, once despised and pushed aside, was now openly taught by Freyja. She taught it in a way that preserved its power without shaming those who practiced it. The Aesir learned that ruling well meant more than knowing what people owed to the law. They also had to understand what luck and chance owed to careful attention. Carved runes and honest spells helped hold the center together. Oaths were sworn on rings that meant something, and those oaths were kept, because now both houses watched them. The councils at Idavol became quieter, more precise. Loud boasting at the table slowly gave way to promises that could be checked when the harvest came in. Freya became welcome at nearly every doorway. With him, winters were hard but fair, and summers generous without becoming lazy. He walked through Midgard as easily as he walked in Asgard, greeted in ploughed fields like an old neighbor who can look at the sky and tell you which cloud will break into rain and which one will drift by. Njord sat with fishermen and shipbuilders, showing them how to read the shifting colors of the water, how to guess where the sandbar had moved after the last storm. Freyja moved from hall to hall, teaching both women and men that real craft needs courage, and that love, too, has work to do. The Vanir did not come to rule or replace. They came to complete what was missing, and you could see the difference in rising loaves of bread and in how arguments ended sooner and more cleanly. The Aesir brought their strengths to the shared table as well. Tyr laid down rules for settling disputes that protected honor without feeding endless feuds. Frigg showed that foresight is not the same as fear, and that a mother can guard a house against vanity just as surely as she guards it against hunger. Thor learned slowly how to sit in judgment without breaking the bench, and sometimes even how to keep order without saying a word. Even Loki, before he grew into his worst self, watched and learned that a sharp tongue could mend a friendship as well as tear one apart. Peace, they all discovered, is not a single spell cast once and then forgotten. It is a collection of habits, watered every day. In the years that followed, the gods remembered the day they had stood on the bare plain between their realms and chosen peace. That memory stayed close whenever old suspicions stirred. The sight of Mimir's preserved head in the high hall was enough to make both princes and poets lower their voices. Kvasir's gentle authority prevented more fights than any spear could have. When visitors arrived from distant halls, they saw two divine families sitting together without stiffness or forced smiles. The truce had grown into true kinship. The gods' company was now one. That peace did something no war ever does. It gave the world more life than it took away. It joined iron to rain, law to abundance. It made room for both sword and flower to be honored without apology. In that new balance, the stories could move on to the next work. Building, guarding, and testing. After peace came caution. The gods had learned that strength without watchfulness is just a broken promise waiting to happen. Giants still gathered beyond the boundary forests. The sea still remembered the flood that had poured from Yma's body. The high plain of the gods needed a strong wall, a barrier that could slow the next disaster long enough for the watchman to blow his horn. So the Aesir sat in council on Idavol and talked of stone, plans, and defenses. While they debated, a stranger appeared in the hall. He was broad-shouldered and tight-lipped, the kind of man who lets his work introduce him. He offered to build a wall around all of Asgard, so strong no giant could climb it, and to finish the job in a single winter. His price hit the hall like a blast of cold air. He asked for Freyja as his bride, and alongside her, the sun and the moon themselves. Silence fell. Everyone understood that giving him what he asked would strip the world of its warmth and joy and leave the sky a dead, brass-colored shell. They were about to refuse when a smooth voice spoke up from the end of the bench. Loki reminded them that an impossible bargain is not really a bargain at all. Let the stranger try, he said, but bind him with terms no mason could possibly meet. It was bold advice, and careless in the way Loki's ideas often were, but the gods accepted it. They set conditions as sharp as a blade. The wall had to be finished by the very first day of summer. The builder had to work alone. He could not receive help from any man. If he fell short by even a single stone, he would get nothing. If he somehow succeeded, he would receive exactly what he had asked for. The mason agreed. Then he asked one more thing: permission to use his stallion to haul the stones. The horse's name was Svadilfari. The gods looked at each other and decided that a horse was not a man. They allowed it. In that small loophole, the real story opened. The work began at once. Through short winter days and long nights, the builder cut stone, shaped it, and set it in place. When darkness fell, Svadilfari leaned into the harness and pulled boulders that 10 oxen could not have dragged. Progress was astonishing. The wall rose straight and true. Each layer of stone fit with a precision that would put a king's tomb to shame. Every morning, the gods walked along the growing rampart and saw long stretches finished while they slept. Winter thinned. The sun climbed higher and began to remember its strength. Only a few rows of stone remained to be laid. Unease spread through the hall. It is one thing to talk about outsmarting a stranger. It is another to watch him nearly succeed. The gods called another council and turned their eyes on Loki until his silence felt heavy. This had been his idea. Now he had to prevent the disaster. If the builder truly won Freyja and the lights of the sky, Asgard would survive only as a cold place of hard speeches and empty fields. Loki raised his hands in a dramatic little shrug and promised that he would take care of it. As always, promising the act was easier than living with what came next. Night fell. The builder harnessed Svadilfari and headed again for the quarry. The snow lay blue and quiet under the stars. Then a sound came from the trees, soft and calling. Svadilfari's ears pricked forward. Out from the birches stepped a mare, small, quick, and beautiful. She moved with a light step and smelled like fresh spring grass after rain. She trotted a short distance away, then turned her head and looked back. Svadilfari forgot the traces, the sled, the stone that waited. He whinnied, tore himself free, and bolted after her into the shadows. The builder cursed and ran after them, but he could not match a love-struck stallion. The two horses vanished among the trunks, leaving him alone under the pale winter moon with a useless sledge. The stallion never came back that night. All the next morning, the builder searched and shouted, but found nothing. At midday, he tried to move the stones alone and discovered that, strong as he was, he couldn't shift rocks that he had planned to tackle with a giant stallion. Evening brought nothing but frustration. The next night, the same thing happened again. The little mare clearly had a mind of her own, and Svadilfari's mind now belonged entirely to her. The deadline crept closer. The last sections of the wall remained undone. When the gods saw that the contract would fail by a small but real margin, they clenched their jaws and waited. On the final day of winter, the stranger raged at the wall, the terms, and the gods who had laughed behind their hands. In his fury, he dropped his disguise. His true nature stood exposed. He was a frost giant, one of the old enemies, wrapped for a time in honest workers' clothes. The instant he revealed himself, the Aesir called for the god they trusted when words were no longer useful. Thor walked out, raised his hammer, and brought it down. The giant's skull rang once, then shattered like thin ice. His body fell among the carefully laid stones. The echo of the blow died just outside the wall he had almost finished. The gods did not boast. They had walked dangerously close to losing everything, and had been saved by a trick they wouldn't be proud to describe in detail. The wall stood high and tight, with only a small gap at the top that would be filled later with less risky labor. Asgard had its fortification. Freyja kept her freedom. The sun and moon continued their steady paths through the sky, but the story wasn't finished. Some months later, a grey foal walked at Loki's side when he returned to the high plain. The foal had 8 legs and a calm in his eyes that comes from knowing no other horse could ever catch him. Loki, of course, had been the mayor in the birch grove, luring Svadilfari away. He had changed shape so well that the stallion had followed him completely. The child of that strange union was Sleipnir, the greatest of all horses, light-footed in the air and sure-footed on the sea. Odin accepted the unusual gift without a word of complaint. From then on, he rode Sleipnir to places no other mount could reach. In time, that horse would carry a messenger all the way to hell and back. In time, he would bear Odin over crashing waves and the heads of men. What had started as a scandal became one of Asgard's greatest treasures. The story keeps 2 columns of truth. In one, the gods are saved by cunning and deception. In the other, they pay a price that can't be measured in gold. Loki crossed a boundary and came back with a gift that made the gods stronger, but also less comfortable. The wall was won, but by methods that left a bitter aftertaste. The lesson is not flattering. Contracts must be written carefully. Advice taken in haste will eventually demand repayment. Strength is necessary when cleverness goes too far. Yet the tale does not argue for a world made only of neat plans and tidy actions. It reminds us that watchfulness is needed, that honest work fills the day, and that the night sometimes requires a kind of art that does not sit well at open council tables. Later, when Heimdall, the watchman, looked out from his tower at Himinbjorg, he saw the new wall catch the morning light and shine it back across the roofs. When cold wind rolled down from the glaciers like a hungry wolf, it hit stone that did not flinch. When messengers arrived at the gate, they passed under an arch built by a giant's hands and a god's demands. This is how the High Ones keep their home, by accepting that order is often built from uneasy partnerships. Even an enemy's strength can be used in the work of safety, so long as someone like Thor is within shouting distance. The wall had barely settled on its foundations before trouble rose again, this time from inside. Loki, restless as ever, crept up behind Sif while she slept and cut off all her glorious hair. In the morning, when everyone saw Sif shorn and ashamed, the hall fell silent. Thor stood up from the bench like a storm rolling in. He grabbed Loki and promised to silence him forever unless Sif's golden hair was restored as if it had never been touched. Loki begged for time and wriggled free, racing down into the deep halls of the dwarfs, where the anvils never cool and the air always smells of coal and metal. He went first to the sons of Ivaldi, master smiths who worked in caves that rang with hammers. He bargained, flattered, and swore that their names would be sung in Asgard if they made a wonder for him. The dwarfs pulled out gold the way a baker pulls dough, stretching and working it until they could spin it into strands finer than the thinnest stalks of wheat at harvest. What they handed back to Loki looked like a handful of soft sunlight. When laid on Sif's head, it would root itself into her scalp, grow like real hair, and never lose its shine. From the same forge they made 2 more marvels. For Odin, they crafted a spear named Gungnir, a weapon destined never to miss whatever target it was aimed at. He waited while they found the thread, and he praised the knot when it held. In the Skaldic tradition, the highest praise is to say that a person speaks with Kvasir's mouth. In the oldest tales, his end is dark and will matter later, for two dwarfs will kill him and brew from his blood a mead that grants poetry and learning. And for now, he lives, and the treaty walks wherever he goes. The covenant also changed custom in Asgard. Scyther, once scorned, was taught by Freyja in a way that kept its power without dishonoring those who practiced it. The Aesir discovered that to govern well, they must know not only what people owe to law, but also what luck owes to careful attention. Sharp runes and honest spells held the center together. Oaths were made on rings that truly mattered and were kept, because both houses watched them. Councils at Idavol grew quieter and more precise. Loud boasting at the table gave way more often to promises that could be checked when the harvest came. And for Freya, the dwarfs built a ship named Skidbladnir, broad of deck and steady on any sea, yet so cleverly made that it could be folded like cloth and carried in a pouch. Loki, sensing a chance to move from fear to praise, decided that 3 gifts were not enough. He crossed to another forge, where 2 brothers worked with fewer words and a steadier rhythm. They were Sindri and his brother Brock, though some call the maker by the name Eitri. Loki spoke like a merchant bargaining at closing time. He boasted that the sons of Ivaldi had made treasures beyond compare, and he laid a wager of his own head that these brothers could not do better. Pride and Craft looked at each other and smiled, and the dwarfs agreed. Sindri placed a lump of pig iron on the anvil and told Brock to keep the bellows blowing without pause, no matter what happened. Loki changed into a biting fly and set about ruining the work with a dedication that might have impressed a saint, if saints had any reason to admire flies. As the iron glowed, Loki fastened onto Brock's hand and drove in his sting. The dwarf's blood ran, but he kept the bellows breathing as if he were the wind itself. Sindri opened the forge and drew out a boar. Its bristles were gold. They shone bright enough that a rider could cross a dark forest at midnight as if it were noon. This was Gullinbursti, the golden-bristled one, a mount for Freya, faster than any horse and tireless in deep snow or over the sea before the wind. Sindri set the boar aside and laid a block of gold in the coals. He warned Brock again not to fail. Loki flew to the back of the dwarf's neck and strung until the blood ran hot. Still, the bellows did not rest. From the mold came a ring, heavy and flawless, named Draupnir. Every 9th night, 8 new rings of equal weight would drip from it, a measured abundance that reminded the gods that true wealth is what returns on a fixed day, not just what sits on a table once. For the last trial, Sindri placed iron again in the forge and told Brock that now a mistake would be costly. This time, Loki landed on Brock's eyelid and bit until blood blinded his eye. The dwarf flinched and brushed at his face, and for a heartbeat the flow of air slowed. Sindri lifted the work from the fire and there lay a hammer. The head was flawless, and its strength would never fail, but the handle was a little short. Even so, the tool bore a name that made silence pay attention. This was Mjolnir, the Crusher, lightning in a hand, a weapon the world needed, even if it did not know it yet. The dwarf brothers carried their gifts to Asgard and demanded a fair judgment. The gods gathered on Idavol, with the light falling slantwise through the high hall. Loki presented the hair that would grow on Sif's head, the spear that would never fail, and the ship that could carry an army and then fold into a bundle. Brock stepped forward with the boar to light the dark, the ring that renewed itself, and the hammer that returned to the hand that threw it. The gods judged with the care of people who have seen tricks before and know how to smell dishonesty. They ruled that the brothers had won. Mjolnir weighed heaviest on the scales, because it would stand between Asgard and ruin when giants came over the ice. Then Brock asked for his payment according to the wager, Loki's head. Loki smiled like a scribe who has just found a hidden line in a contract. He admitted that his head had indeed been wagered, but pointed out that his neck had not. To remove one without harming the other was impossible. The gods were not a court built for cheap tricks, but they did appreciate a neat point when it served justice. Brock accepted that he could not claim the neck, but said nothing about the mouth. He took a leather thong and an awl and stitched Loki's lips shut. For a time, the hall rested from sharp remarks that cut deeper than they sounded. When the stitches were later removed, the scar remained, a reminder that speech is both a tool and a danger. The gifts were handed out with honor. Sif's golden hair was placed upon her head and took hold like ivy. It grew at once and shone, and with it her dignity stood whole again. Odin received Gungnir, the spear, and used its point to mark treaties so that oaths would hold. He took Draupnir as well and set it upon the altar, for the ring measured time and brought steady bounty. Freya claimed Skidbladnir for the seasons when the gods would sail north, and for every journey where harbours were small and wines uncertain. He took Gullinbursti as his proud companion on dark rides and narrow paths. When mountain trails were thin as a knife, Thor lifted Mjolnir and felt that his hand was finally complete. The hammer would crack any giant's skull. It would fly out and return. It would bless a cradle and a marriage bed with the same sure grace it carried into war. He laid it across his knees, and the hall seemed to breathe easier. Old verses love to count what these wonders can do. When Thor hurls the hammer, mountains remember the blow. When Odin casts Gungnir over a battlefield, he dedicates the fight to himself, and fate pulls its lines tighter. When Freya rides the golden boar, the harvest remembers how to fill the grain jars. When Skidbladnir is spread, it can carry a band of gods. When it is folded, it fits beneath a cloak. When the 9th night comes, Draupnir drops its golden brood, and the temple chest is full in a way that is both practical and sacred. When Sif walks, light plays over her hair, and people remember that beauty restored after damage is not vanity. It is proof that a household has survived a storm. It is tempting to say that Loki learned a moral lesson that day. What he truly learned was technique. He would return to the dwarf forges in later stories, not always for good reasons. Yet even here, where spite and panic began the business, the result was a strengthening of the realm. Asgard now held tools worthy of its responsibilities. The gods saw that craft stands equal to courage, that law without gifts is cold, and that gifts without law invite theft. The dwarfs went back to their caves with the quiet pride of makers who have matched a boast with proof. The trickster nursed his torn mouth and let thoughts of revenge coil in the back of his mind, thoughts that one day would cost the world more than a head or a scar. In the evenings that followed, when council was finished and the meat was carved, Thor would sometimes set Mjolnir on the table and draw a finger along its edge, as if greeting an old friend. Odin would weigh Draupnir in his palm and feel time itself like a heartbeat. Freya might have Skidbladnir opened out in the yard just to watch its ribs spread and its sail catch a friendly breeze. Sif would unbraid her hair and let it fall like a river over her shoulders. In such moments, the gods looked less like distant legends and more like people who understood exactly what it means to keep a home safe in a dangerous world. Among the many names of the High God, there is one that rises whenever the story turns to knowledge bought at a price. Odin is called All-Father not only because he leads the gods, but because he feeds his mind on every source of wisdom he can reach. Valor is common coin in Asgard. Clear sight is rarer. Odin wanted that sight so deeply that he went searching for the oldest spring beneath the world tree, the well kept by Mimir, whose counsel lasts like iron cooled in cold water. The road to that well is not kind. It lies under a root that reaches out toward the lands of giants, where the stone seems to hold its breath and the wind is thin and sharp. There Mimir sits almost like a shape grown from the rock itself, a guardian who does not flatter the thirsty. The water he keeps is not a roadside fountain. It is memory stored since the first crack of thunder. It does not give fast answers to those looking for shortcuts. It offers patterns only to those willing to carry their weight. Odin came to the well and asked for a drink. He did not beg. He stated his need the way a king declares a claim. Mimir answered like a keeper who knows exactly how valuable his charge is. He named a price that would mark the bargain forever. Odin had to leave one of his eyes in the depths. Odin agreed at once. He plucked out his eye and dropped it into the water. The spring accepted it. In that moment, he gained a kind of vision that does not belong to a face. From then on, his one remaining eye looked outward at the world, while the eye in the well looked backward into the deep past and downward into the dark. He paid and he drank. What he received in that swallow was not a list of facts. He tasted how fate grows, slowly and stubbornly, like lichen on stone. He saw that counsel only truly helps when it is taken before the spear is raised, not after. He understood that even wise kings must pay for understanding with something that will never grow back. This first sacrifice made him sharper, not gentler. He realized that the hidden grammar of the world was written in signs older than any spoken language, and he set himself to win them. He turned away from feasts and comfort, and chose an ordeal no other god even considered. At the very heart of the ash, he chose a branch that leaned over darkness. There he wounded himself with his own spear and gave himself to himself. He hung for 9 nights and 9 days. He drank nothing. He ate nothing. He stared downward where the wind scraped the bark and the roots exhaled cold from the deep. Old verses keep his voice plain and unadorned. He says he hung on the tree whose roots no one fully knows. He says he was pierced and given to the god that he is, which means he paid himself into his own keeping. He says he peered down until he saw shapes of power turning and flashing beneath him like fish just below the water's skin. These were the runes. They were not decorations, and not only an alphabet. Each rune was a small treaty between will and the world, a stroke that could persuade wood, water, and iron to listen for a while. When he recognized them at last, he reached, grasped them, and fell from the branch. He stood again on the ground, changed in a way that even his friends found unsettling. Afterward, he taught the names and uses of the signs only to those who could bear them without foolishness. He kept the hardest burdens for himself. He learned charms that bind and loosen, that close wounds and cool fevered heads. He learned how to dull a sharp blade without touching the metal, how to tie a knot in the wind so a sailor could buy a breath of breeze when the sea lay flat, how to pull the heat away from a fire licking at a friend's shield, and how to free a captive without breaking a single link in the chain. The poems count more than a dozen such workings and hint at others left unspoken, because truly wise people do not brag too loud about that kind of power. To make sure his new sight served more than a single moment, Odin built his days around counsel. Each dawn he sent out his ravens. One is called Thought, the other Memory. They flew all over the world and returned at evening to settle on his shoulders and speak softly into his ears. Their news was not gossip. They brought the grain of the day, what brave deeds were attempted, what promises kings made, what strange things happened on lonely roads and bright seas. In the high hall, 2 grey wolves lay at his feet, and he shared more food with them than he ate himself. He sat while the company feasted and listened, letting his mind follow the lines of events that his eye in the well and his eye in his head showed him. Because he had drunk from Mimir's spring, he kept seeking wisdom in many forms. He spoke with women who could see what was coming when others saw only steam on a kettle. He paid fairly for truths spoken by those who lived at the edges of the world and did not need praise from any court. Odin kept Mimir's preserved head close by, treated with herbs and held together with spells, and he continued to speak with it, not like someone controlling a puppet, but like a student sitting at the feet of an elder. He felt no shame in this. In these stories, a king is not mocked for listening. He is respected for knowing the difference between advice that costs little and advice that costs much. What Odin gained from his sacrifices did not make him soft. They made him steady, focused, and deeply aware of consequence. When he raised his spear over a battlefield, he did it as someone who understood the true cost of every decision. The grief of mothers, the hunger of winter, the time that must pass before wounds heal. Yet he also knew that some dangers grow worse if ignored. When he dealt with giants, he did not grab for Thor's hammer, not because he feared them, but because he knew the innocent always pay when truces are broken. And when he chose warriors for his hall, he chose not only the brave, but those who kept their oaths even when it was difficult. Poets say he values this as much as courage. People worshipped him in ways that reflected his nature. Those who offered themselves by hanging from a branch knew him as the god who walks the border between life and knowledge. Those who carved runes into axe handles or barn beams believed that order must be cut into the world, not simply declared. Those who whispered their prayers before a risky voyage brought him a portion of what they owned and asked him to watch closely. And he did, if their request carried weight. There is firmness in this picture of him, but no darkness. The old sayings are clear. Wisdom is available, but you must pay its price. The vision he gained at Mimir's well made him the kind of king who could look a friend in the eye and speak a difficult truth without flinching. The strength he earned on the tree made him a maker of songs that do not flatter and spells that stay whole even when storms pound the rafters. Other gods may enjoy feasts, contests, or gold. Odin loves the quiet moment before a decision, when a person can clearly see the path he must take. Over the seasons that followed Odin's sacrifices, the worlds changed in small but meaningful ways. Our judgments given under Yggdrasil grew sharper, cleaner. People took their oaths on the ring with more care, because it felt as if the ring itself was listening. The watchman's horn did not blow more often, but when it did, the gods moved with a practiced quickness, the sort that belongs to people who rehearse without bragging about rehearsal. It wasn't magic alone that kept the center of the world together. It was the attention paid to how each part connected to the next. From the first sip at Mimir's spring to the night he hung on the tree and learned the runes, Odin shaped himself into a ruler who understood that power without understanding is like a hand wrapped in leather. You cannot feel the work you are trying to do. He did not pursue all this knowledge to shine in a story. He pursued it because even a world built from a giant's skull and guarded by a hammer needs someone who can see danger coming before others notice it. During this peaceful era, the gods had time to listen, and from that listening came the living symbol of their truce, Kvasir, who walked the realms offering answers as neatly fitted as a key in a well-made lock. He did not argue. He made things clear. He visited smoky halls and deep caverns, and no riddle defeated him. But wisdom has enemies. Two dwarfs, Fjalla and Gala, invited him to sit with them, then murdered him. They drained his blood, mixed it with honey, and brewed a mead so powerful that a single mouthful could bring poetry, intelligence, and insight. They named the vessels Othraria, Bothan, and Son. And from that moment, poets said that good verse was Kvasir's blood, and wise speech was the drink of Othraria. But the dwarfs weren't finished with their cruelty. They drowned a giant named Gilling, then killed his grieving wife by dropping a millstone on her. Their son, Suttung, demanded justice. He set them on a rock in the tide and was prepared to let the sea take them. They bought their lives by giving him the mead. Suttung hid it deep inside a mountain called Hnitbjörg and put his daughter Gunnlod to guard it. Odin learned of all this as a king learns of things that threaten his people. He understood the mead was not just a drink, it was ordered fire, the kind that teaches the tongue to speak true. He decided he would win it for the gods, and for humans who could use it well. He put on a traveling cloak and a working name, Bölvika, meaning the one who does difficult deeds. On a summer day, he found 9 men mowing a field. They complained about the dullness of their scythes. He took out a whetstone and sharpened each blade until it cut like light on water. They begged to buy the stone. Odin tossed it into the air. They fought for it and killed one another. With quiet steps, he walked to the farm of Borgi, Suttung's brother. Borgi's 9 servants were dead. The harvest season was slipping away, and he stood helpless. Odin offered to do the work of all 9 if Borgi would request 1 drink of the mead as payment. Borgi accepted. Odin worked the field flawlessly, but when Borgi asked Suttung for the agreed sip, Suttung refused. Odin then gave Borgi an auger and told him to bore into the mountain. Borgi lied about the hole being finished, but Odin tested it and forced him to drill again. When the dust blew inward, Odin shifted into a snake and slipped through the hole. Borgi tried to stab him out of jealousy, but Odin was already beyond reach. Inside sat Gunnlod, guarding the mead. Odin did not sneak past her. He spoke to her with calm respect. She invited him to sit. He asked for a bed for 1 night. She asked for a promise that honored her loneliness. He stayed 3 nights, and together they spoke and listened, trading warmth like coals in winter. In the end, she gave him 3 drinks, 1 from each vessel. He kept his promise, but when he drank each vat dry. The entire supply flowed into him. He changed into a great eagle and burst into the sky. Suttung shifted into an eagle and chased him. They tore across the heavens like 2 storms fighting for the same sky. In Asgard, the gods saw Odin approaching and placed vats beneath the wall. He arrived in a final sweep of wind and spilled the mead into the tubs. Suttung, defeated, returned to his mountain. Not all the mead made it to safety. Some dripped along the flight path. Those drops became the share of fools who mistake speed for skill, and of scholars who know too much and understand too little. The good portion stayed with the gods. Odin gave it carefully. He offered a sip to a young person who listened more than he spoke. He blessed a woman who could recite laws clearly enough to quiet a room. He gave a taste to a boy who kept rowers moving through slate with his verses. He poured a little onto a craftsman's tongue so he could carve runes that steadied a hall in a storm. When someone asked for more and Odin refused, it was not meanness. It was respect for the maid and for the work it was meant to serve. Every part of this story teaches something. The dwarfs teach that skill without conscience ruins lives. The giant Suttung shows how grief can harden into greed. Gunlord shows that duty can bend without breaking. Borgi shows what happens when a man cannot say no. And Odin shows that cunning used to protect order is a kind of harvest. He stole the maid, but he stole it from thieves, and he lifted it into a purpose far greater than any locked chamber. Because of his theft, the North remembered that words are work. The maid didn't turn fools into geniuses. It raised those who were willing to learn. It created verses that could carry a ship across dark water and laws that could carry a family through a harsh winter. It created historians whose lists do not taste like dust, and riddle makers who do not waste your evening. And sometimes, late at night in Asgard, when the bench is quiet, a cup passes that glows darker than wine and brighter than water. Odin lifts it like a farmer lifting a bucket from a well, studying the reflection. He drinks, and somewhere in Midgard, a young poet finds the right words. A sailor finds a way to honor a fallen friend. A child speaks a proverb that stops an older man from making a mistake. The mead has traveled again. And so the mead of poetry joined the runes and the eye in the well as part of Odin's deepest identity. He paid, he suffered, he stole, and each time he made the world a little stronger. Thor, meanwhile, rarely sat long. Noise, storms, wheels, and wind suited him. When he travelled, he rode in a chariot pulled by two goats whose names crackled like sparks in a fire. Thor's chariot is pulled by two goats with names that crackle like sparks in a fire, Tangunjosta and Tangrisnir. When night catches him out in the wild, he does something that would sound horrifying if you didn't know how his world works. He slaughters them for dinner, cleans the bones, and lays them neatly on their skins. At dawn, he raises Mjolnir over the remains. The bones knit, the flesh returns. The goats stand up, shake their ears, and breathe as if they've only had a long nap. There is just one rule: never break the bones. Once a poor farmer learned this the hard way. Loki, always sniffing out trouble, encouraged the farmer's son to crack a leg bone for the rich marrow inside. It seemed harmless in the cold, hungry night, but in the morning one of the goats rose with a limp. Thor saw the splintered bone, felt anger roll through him like distant thunder, and scowled. He did not crush the family. Instead, he forgave them, but took a price. He claimed the children, Thialfi and Röskva, a keen-eyed boy and his steady sister. From that day on, they ran at Thor's side. With Loki beside him and Thialfi at his heels, Thor turned east, toward the land of the giants. He refused the shining rainbow bridge. He preferred to wade rivers, feeling the current and the stones under his feet. Beyond the walls of Asgard, the world felt larger and stranger. The trees grew farther apart in those giant forests. The sky seemed to stand higher overhead. One night they found a huge hall with a low door, no smoke hole, and a strange, damp smell. They were tired, and tired travelers don't ask too many questions. They lay down and slept on the sloping floor. Before dawn, the building shuddered. The ground trembled. The walls creaked like an old ship at sea. Thor sprang to the doorway, hammer in hand. Outside, something vast lay curled in the valley, a giant so large that a single glove dangling from his belt would have looked like a house to smaller people. The hall where Thor had slept was the thumb of that glove. The smell that had bothered him was simply the sweat of the giant who had thrown it aside. His name was Skrymir. Their talk was not warm, but it did not break into violence. Skrymir spoke calmly, like someone who never needs to raise his voice. He tied his food into a heavy leather bag, and asked if Thor and his companions would share the road. They walked all day beneath impossible trees that rose like pillars into the clouds. That evening, Skrymir tossed the food bag to Thor and told him to eat. The knot on the bag had been tied with some clever twist of sinew. Thor pulled until his hands hurt. He chewed the strap. He tried every trick he knew. The bag did not open. Hunger sharpened his temper. He stepped back, gripped Mjolnir, and struck Skrymir's skull with a blow that would have shattered a cliff. The giant opened one eye and asked if a leaf had fallen. Skrymir rolled over and went back to sleep. Around midnight, Thor tried again. Both hands on the handle, he brought the hammer down with all the force that fills the old poems. Skrymir moved and wondered aloud if a bird had dropped a twig on his head. He snored. Near dawn, Thor gathered every thread of his strength and swung until the hammer blurred. The giant woke, rubbed his forehead, and asked if a nut had fallen from a tree. Then he got up, pointed them toward a distant stone fortress called Utgarda, and walked away. Later, Thor found 3 deep dents in a nearby hill. That was where his blows had actually landed. He understood then that his strength had been turned aside by magic, like a river diverted into hidden channels. Anger flared, but he folded it small and carried it with him. The fortress of Utgarda stood on the flat land like a grey cliff pretending to be a wall. Standing with his shoulder against it, Thor could not see the top. The main gate was shut. There was no handle or latch on the outside. They walked the wall, searching for a seam, and found none. In the end, Thialfi slipped between the bars of the gate like a thread, and the others followed. Inside, a great hall was full of giants. Their king sat at the high seat with a face as hard and cold as a winter sky. He called himself Utgarda Loki. His welcome was polite, but his politeness had steel in it. He announced that no guest could stay unless he proved himself in a contest. That is not an invitation Thor is good at refusing. It is also not one Loki can resist. Loki spoke first. He boasted that he could eat faster than anyone in the hall. The giants set a long trough on the floor and piled it high with meat. At the far end stood his challenger, a thin man with a calm gaze, named Loki. At the signal, they began. Loki ate as if he had been raised in a world of feasts and famines both, tearing his way down the trough. He reached the middle and swallowed his last mouthful, hands held up to show them empty. Loki had eaten to the same point and beyond. Meat, bones, and even the wooden trencher beneath were gone. Utgarda Loki nodded and said Loki had eaten well, but not as well as fire eats. Loki, he explained, was not a man at all, but fire itself, walking in a man's shape. Thialfi stepped forward next. He said he could outrun anyone present. The king called his runner, a tall, narrow-shouldered youth named Hugi. They went outside to the flat ground and raced. The first race was over so quickly that Thialfi was still far from the finish when Hugi crossed it. Thialfi demanded another chance. The second race was only less humiliating because everyone pretended to be polite. The third left no doubt. The king praised the boy's courage and then explained gently, Hugi means thought. No one outruns thought. Now all eyes turned to Thor. Utgarda Loki pointed to a large drinking horn hanging on the wall. Any grown man, he said, who wished to be counted strong should drain it in a single pull, or 2 at most. Certainly no one would need 3. The horn was big but not absurd. Thor raised it and drank long and hard. When he set it down, the level had dropped only the width of a finger. The benches muttered. The king called the effort gallant, which did not help. Thor drank again. The fall was barely more than the first. He drank a third time until his chest burned. and still the ale hovered high in the horn. He set it down and said nothing. Loki remarked that he had seen many men do better, and very few do worse. The words walked right along the edge of politeness. Thor's hand stayed away from the hammer by nothing more than iron self-control. The king suggested a different challenge. He said he had a cat that played around his feet and amused the company. If Thor wanted to show his strength, he could simply lift the cat from the floor. The animal padded in, long and grey, its eyes pale and watchful. Thor slid his hands under its belly and heaved. The cat arched and arched more, its back climbing like the roof of a hall, its paws stretching toward the corners of the world. Thor strained until his knees shook. Finally, he managed to raise one paw off the floor. Just one. The hall burst into laughter. The king said he'd expected more from the famous thunder god. Thialfi bit his lip. Loki stared at the rafters, holding his tongue like a man holding a hot coal. The last trial was wrestling. Loki said he had no man in his hall who was a proper match for Thor, but he did have an old woman named Ellie. She came in veiled and moved slowly, measuring each step. Thor took hold of her gently, at first out of respect. Her grip closed on him like wet rope tightening around a post. He pushed, but she bent and did not fall. He tried to hook her ankle. She planted her foot, and his balance slipped away as if the floor had turned to mud. He dug in, called on his full strength, and still she drove him down to one knee. The hall clapped in rhythm, and the king ended the match with a raised hand. They did not attack him or throw him out. Instead, the guests were given a place at the table and fed well. Insults here did not automatically lead to blood. Thor sat quietly, eyes measuring distances that no one else could see. At dawn, Loki walked them outside the walls and finally told the truth. Skrymir had indeed been what he seemed, but the knot on the food bag had been bound with magic. The 3 craters in the hillside were where Thor's hammer actually struck. Any one of those blows would have killed a giant if it had landed cleanly on a skull. Inside the fortress, he said, every contest had been wrapped in illusion. Loki had competed against wildfire itself. Thialfi had raced against thought. The drinking horn had been connected to the sea. Thor's efforts to empty it were what men later noticed as the tide. The cat had been the Midgard Serpent disguised, coiled around the world's edge, and Thor had lifted enough of it that the whole earth had shifted. The old woman was old age. No one has ever thrown old age. Thor's face went white with anger. He reached for Mjolnir and stepped toward the giant king to end the tricks permanently. Loki lifted his hand, and in that instant the fortress, the walls, the hall, all of it, vanished like frost under sunlight. There was only open plain and clean air. Loki and Thialfi stood still, understanding that some victories come from refusing to strike, and some defeats are really lessons. Thor realized he had been tested with illusions, because the land itself might have broken if he'd used his full strength unchecked. He tightened the strap on his hammer and turned back toward Asgard. He had not gained a single boast that day, but the giants had learned what kind of neighbor lived beyond the boundary forests. Later, when skalds told this story by winter firelight, men nodded and agreed. Power and cleverness are both needed to keep Midgard safe. Another day, Thor woke and reached for the familiar weight beside him, the square head, the short handle that fit his palm like it had grown there. His fingers closed on empty bedding. The space where Mjolnir should have been felt like a missing door in the side of the world. He sat up, and the silence in the hall grew heavy and sharp. He found Loki and said only, "The hammer is gone." Loki didn't joke. This was not a problem for long debates and slow thinking. He went straight to Freyja and asked for her falcon cloak, the one that lets a god fly like a gust of wind from cliff to cliff. Freyja did not delay. As she opened her chest, handed him the feathered mantle, and asked no questions. Loki wrapped it around himself and his body shifted. A man vanished. A falcon with clever eyes took flight. He flew east, over lands that grew rougher and emptier, until he saw a burial mound and a giant seated on it, braiding gold for his dogs and stroking the manes of his horses, as if wealth and grooming were the same habit. This was Thrym. Loki landed and spoke in the careful, riddling style that giants respect. Thrym wasted no time. He confessed at once. He had taken Mjolnir and buried it 8 leagues underground, so deep that no god could find it. He would return it only if Freyja came to him as his bride. He said this with the same tone a man might use when naming a fair price for a cartload of timber. Loki's wings beat once. He turned and flew back to Asgard like a spark flying toward dry straw. When Thor heard, he did not stand and make a speech. He went straight to Freyja and told her what Thrym demanded. She did not pretend to think it over. The great necklace Brisingamen trembled on her chest, and a wave of anger rolled through the room like a storm tide. She refused so fiercely that the floorboards seemed to knock against one another. The gods gathered in council. They sat heavily on their benches. Disaster sat with them. Asgard had wit, but no amount of clever talk could replace the hammer. They needed a plan, and they needed it quickly. Then Heimdall spoke. His eyes see farther into what is coming than most gods dare to look. He said there was a way. Heimdall's idea sounded like a joke at first. Dress Thor as the bride. Put the keys of a married woman at his belt. Lay Freyja's shining necklace, Brisingamen, on his chest. Pull a thick bridal veil over his face, and seat him beside a quick-tongued maid who could cover for him with words. Loki, of course, volunteered to be the maid. Thor scowled. He said the halls of Asgard would never stop talking if he walked around in a wedding dress. Loki replied that there would be no halls left to talk in at all if Mjolnir didn't come home. The gods looked at each other, saw that there was no better plan, and agreed. They dressed him carefully. Freyja herself lent the necklace. The women of Asgard brought brooches and rings, piling on enough gold and silver to soften even a body that had thrown down giants. They hung a ring of keys from his belt, the sign of a married woman who runs a large household. They pulled the veil low, hiding the eyes that usually gleam like the inside of a forge. Loki slipped into a maid's dress and hid a small knife in the folds. Even handmaids, he said, should have something to rely on in a strange house. The goat-drawn chariot waited in the yard. Thor and Loki climbed aboard. The wheels rattled over stone, and the sky seemed to grow harder and higher as they left the safe lands behind and rolled toward the edge of the giant country. Thrym's hall stood tall and rough, like rock that had only half agreed to be a building. He came out grinning, teeth all counted, to meet the bride he had demanded. He called for benches, meat, and a feast to seal the bargain that would give him a goddess for his bed, and the hammer that blesses house, birth, and burial. The giants brought in an ox roasted whole, fish on broad platters, and vats of mead that smelled faintly of flowers and iron. The bride, still veiled, sat down and began to eat. She ate an entire ox down to the bone. As she swallowed 8 fat salmon in a row, she cleared every dish of sweets. She drained 3 whole barrels of mead. With every bite, the hall grew quieter. Thrym shifted uneasily and leaned toward the maid. He whispered that he had never seen a woman eat like that and live. Loki bowed, all politeness, and answered in a soft, practiced voice. The bride, he said, had not eaten for 8 nights, so eager was she to come to Jotunheim. She had refused every bite the way a child refuses sleep on the night before a fair. Thrym, very pleased by this idea, nodded and relaxed. Soon it was time for the wedding rites. Thrym leaned in to kiss the bride and lifted the veil. Instead of soft, shy eyes, he found himself staring into a gaze that burned like red coals stirred by a fresh wind. He jerked back and again turned to the maid. Loki did not panic. He explained smoothly that the bride had not slept for 8 nights either. Her eyes, he said, were hot with love and with the strain of travel. The giants laughed and reached for their cups, content with that answer. Thrym then called for the hammer to be brought in, to bless the marriage in the old giant way. Servants entered, carrying Mjolnir the way 4 men might carry a sacred stone. They laid it gently on the veiled bride's lap. In that moment, everything that had felt ridiculous suddenly became dangerous. The bride's hands moved like hunting hawks. The veil flew back. Thor rose inside the wedding dress, towering over the benches, and roared loud enough to rattle the beams. His hand closed around the short handle that had always known his grip. One swing, and Thrym's skull shattered like thin ice in spring. Another blow, and his kinsmen fell where they sat. Thrym's sister had asked for gold as a mourning gift from the bride. Thor gave her what his hands provide, a hammer stroke that ended her request forever. The hall emptied of life in an instant. Cups rolled, benches crashed, and silence fell under the sound of breaking wood and bone. Loki tore off his maid's dress and kept moving, because there are moments when even clever words must admit that the conversation has passed to the hammer. Thor strode out through the doors, Mjolnir on his shoulder, ruin behind him. The goats snorted and pawed at the ground, ready. The road that had been long and heavy with fear suddenly felt short. Rain began to fall, soft and light, as if the sky itself were settling the dust and closing the story. They crossed back into the gods' own lands, and the wall of Asgard received them. Brisingamen went back to Freyja's neck. The keys were rehung on their hooks. Mjolnir once again rested where it belonged, at Thor's belt. No one in Asgard sang a grand song about Thor in a bridal veil. That part was for private laughter over shared cups. The laughter did not cheapen what had happened. It reminded them that courage is not always serious on the surface. Sometimes it wears lace and a veil. The story taught them something they didn't forget. The hammer is not only a weapon. It blesses beds and doorways, newborn children and new homes. Even Thrym, who tried to steal it, had wanted it as a holy object for his marriage. He knew its power to bless, even if he meant to twist that power for himself. The old poem that holds this tale loves a good joke, but it also keeps its lesson clear. It shows Loki's cleverness working in service of order when it's time to repair what has been broken. It shows that Thor's huge hunger and huge strength are the same engines that keep the middle world safe. When the hammer is missing, a hall loses its ease. When it returns, it brings not only safety, but the power to bless again. After this, men began to wear small hammer pendants under their shirts, and brides asked for a hammer to be placed on their laps during wedding rites. The story had slipped quietly into custom, holding families and houses together in its shadow. When the thunder rolled again across the sky, people heard not just warning, but relief. The goats stamped in their stall at night and walked soundly. The watchman on the tower turned a little easier in his patrol. Poets found their words. Firelight on the hearth looked like a friend instead of a threat. Asgard slept its first calm sleep after the loss. In the morning, Thor stood in the yard, turning Mjolnir over in his hand, as if reminding both himself and the hammer that they were one thing. Yet even as peace settled, another kind of tension moved in the background. Loki's seat among the gods had always been uncertain. He had sworn a bond of brotherhood with Odin, drinking the pledge that ties one life to another. But his bloodline ran back to the giants. His father is named Farborti, his mother Laufey or Narl. Wherever he goes, trouble walks beside brilliance like a twin. Far away in a dark forest called Ironwood, Loki had once loved a woman named Angerbotha, she who brings sorrow near. With her, he had 3 children who were unlike any others. Their births felt less like family news and more like little notes written in the margin of fate. The first was a serpent too strange for any farmyard. Jörmungandr was small at first, cool and damp in the hands, carrying the chill of Niflheim in its scales. Odin looked down once, then again, and did not see a harmless garden snake. He saw the hint of a problem big enough to circle the world. He took the young serpent and threw it into the great ocean that rings Midgard. There Jörmungandr found food, room, and endless horizon. It grew and grew, becoming longer, stronger, and cleverer, until its body encircled the world and its jaws closed on its own tail. The slow rise and fall of its breathing became the rise and fall of the sea itself. Some fishermen claim that, far below their boats, they have seen a pale eye open in the dark water. They come home quieter and more careful with their promises. Sailors sing of a day when Thor will take an ox's head as bait and cast a line into deep water, with the hammer ready in his hand. That day still waits in the future. And for now, it is enough to know that the world serpent lies in its place, and the ocean knows its weight. The second child was a wolf born with the shoulders of a king. They called him Fenrir, Fenriswolf, and other heavy names. His paws were too large for a cub. His hunger seemed to have no end. At first, the gods did not kill him. They decided that an enemy kept where you can see him is better than an enemy raised in shadows. They hoped in their way that he might be tamed by nearness and care. Only Thor was brave enough to feed him. Every day, he brought meat in both hands and learned the sound of Fenrir's breathing. But the wolf grew and grew, as if each rib added a season, and each season doubled the next. Wise women had already spoken prophecies in quiet corners. They said this wolf would break chains no smith could make, and that one day his wide mouth would close on the highest of the gods. The air around Fenrir's pen felt tight, like a bowstring drawn and waiting. The gods did not talk openly about what might come. They counted meat and quietly sharpened their wits. The third child was a girl whose body carried 2 truths at once. Her name was Hel. One half of her looked alive and human. The other half was dark and dead, like a winter bruise under the skin. Odin sent her down and outward to the far root of the world where cold springs rise. He gave her a realm and a duty. Her land is called Hel or Helheim. It is the place where all those who die of age, sickness, or sorrow go, any death that does not come in battle. Her hall is named Iljuthnia. Her dish is hunger, and her knife is famine. Her bed is called sick bed, and the curtains around it have a name that means bleak and flickering. Her servants move slowly, as if their joints are made of twilight itself. At a cave called Nipperhelia, the hound Garm lifts his head and bays when a new soul arrives. Over the river Gjöl, a bridge glows pale like frost in moonlight. A maiden named Modgud stands there and asks each traveller for their name and purpose. Beyond her stands Hel's gate, and beyond that stretch long fields without sun, where most of humankind will eventually dwell. It is not only a place of punishment, it is also a place of keeping. Its sting is not fire, but memory. The gods' choices about these three children were not random. The serpent they threw to the outermost sea to serve as a living belt around the world. The wolf they kept close, inside their own defenses where they could watch him, though that choice would cost them sleep and later blood. The girl they placed on a throne and gave real authority, trusting her to keep what must be kept. They understood that some forces cannot be erased. They can only be placed carefully, so they do their work without tearing everything down. Hel's realm changed how men in Midgard treated their dead. They buried shoes with the bodies so the long road would not be walked in bare feet. They placed a coin, a tool, or a token in the hand, not to buy passage from some foreign boatman, but to carry value into a land where value is measured in how well you are remembered. They spoke the name of the dead at the door and tied knots in cords to steady their grief. When a body was burned on a ship, people said the bright ones had called. When a body was laid in the earth, they spoke of hell as a house whose door would one day open for them too. Prophecies ran ahead of these three children like shadows before a storm. A seer's song, brought long ago by Odin, tells of a woman in Ironwood who raises wolfkin and sends them against the sky. It speaks of the sun and moon feeling hungry jaws. It says the world serpent will rise and spray poison over land and sea. It tells of a great wolf breaking what no one thought could break, and of hell opening her gates so an army of the ordinary dead can march under a pale banner. These things have not happened yet, but they stand like stone markers along a road the gods already walk. Loki never bragged about these children in Asgard. He did not bring cradles into the hall, but he did not deny them either. When the gods spoke privately of the children of sorrow, they were also speaking about the deals they had already stuck with fate. Odin had given up an eye for deeper sight, and a part of himself for the runes. He knew the cost of pretending you have not heard a prophecy, so he set the serpent in the sea. He set the girl on her throne. He kept the wolf where eyes could watch him, knowing that soon meat and iron alone would not be enough. The way everything was arranged had its own cold logic. The sea now held its great coil, the world serpent lying silent in the depths. The underworld had its queen, Hel, ruling with strict, steady fairness. The courtyard of the gods held its chained danger, the wolf that grew larger every time he was fed. In the Middle Lands, people still plowed their fields, married, raised children, and sang songs. But a new taste crept into those songs, a sharpness that didn't come from sea salt. People were starting to feel that time was counted not only in days and nights, but in promises and unpaid debts. The whole world felt like a game played out on a board made from Ymir's bones, and on that board, Loki's three strange children were pieces that could never be put away again. The poets who love to list names and places so that fear stays inside lines of verse also remind us that Loki's home held other lives as well. Sigyn sat beside him, loyal beyond normal human patience. And from their marriage came sons whose names changed between the stories, but whose futures will be tied to punishments the tale has not yet reached. And long before that, Loki had once taken the shape of a mare and lured away a builder's stallion, becoming the mother of Odin's eight-legged horse. That was a story about clever craft. These newer children, though the serpent, the wolf, and Hel belonged to foreboding, they prove that the trickster does not only bring help, he also brings the signs of how things will end. And so the world settled into a careful, uneasy balance. The gods still held their feasts, still judged disputes, still rode out at dawn to sit by the roots of the world tree. At night, some of them woke and listened for a distant surf that wasn't water, but something heavier, like breath or threat. To still fed the wolf and said nothing about the tightness in his chest. Fishermen fixed their nets and watched the empty horizon, as if a low line of land had quietly appeared where there should be only sea. Women who washed the dead spoke more softly when they came back to the fire. Yggdrasil still stood and drank from its wells. The squirrel still ran up and down the trunk, carrying insults. The dragon still chewed at the roots. The Norns still carved fate. But under all of this there was a feeling. In a world like this, the next wise thing is to bind anything that can still be bound. Fenrir grew as if each season wrapped itself around his bones. The chunks of meat he ate were the size of oxen. His water was poured into troughs made from entire hollowed logs. His breath steamed in the air even in summer, and his eyes learned suspicion. The prophecy about him moved alongside his life like a shadow beside a rider. This wolf would one day throw down the greatest of the gods. The Aesir decided to watch him rather than try to kill him. They told themselves that a danger you can see is safer than one you cannot. Only two every day placed a hand on the wolf's muzzle and brought him meat, with the quiet bravery of someone who already knows what it might cost. As Fenrir's paws grew heavier and his tracks pressed deeper into the ground, the gods suggested a test of strength. They had the dwarfs make a massive chain of iron, thick as a strong man's wrist and cleverly forged. They called it Liding. Then they invited Fenrir to show off his power and let them bind him with it. The wolf seemed amused. He stood calm while they wound the chain around him. At the signal, he pulled. The iron held for a heartbeat, then shattered like rotten ice. Shards flashed into the grass. Fenrir shook himself as casually as a dog shaken free of rain. The gods clapped and praised him loudly, pretending to be impressed, though this was exactly what they had expected. They tried again. A second chain was made, even heavier and reinforced with runes meant to make it stubborn and hard to break. This one they named Dromi. Once more they invited Fenrir, and once more he agreed. The first time he strained, the chain held. His eyes narrowed. Then he dug his claws into the ground and threw his whole body against it in one great heave. The stones cracked under his feet. The final link snapped and flew into a nearby birch tree with a sound like a shield being struck. The wolf's teeth showed in a soundless laugh. The gods smiled thinly and went aside to speak in low voices. Odin sent secret messengers to the dark, deep places where the dwarfs work. He asked their mastersmiths for a third binding, one that wasn't made of iron, something that would not invite brute strength to answer brute strength. The dwarfs requested 6 strange things, the kind that do not easily fit inside a normal mind. The sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spit of a bird. And from these impossibilities they wove a ribbon. It was soft to the touch, light as silk, smooth as a summer sash, and stronger than any chain that had ever touched a forge. They named it Gleipnir. They said that from then on, men would never again hear cats walking, nor see bearded women, nor watch mountains pulled up by the roots. Bears would keep their hidden strength, fish would leave no footprints in the sea, and birds' spit would vanish in the air, because all those things had been poured into this one unseen force. The gods carried Gleipnir to a black lake called Amsvartnir, and to the small island at its center, Lyngvi. There, under a cold sky, they spoke to Fenrir like friends eager to witness a great feat. The wolf sniffed the ribbon. It looked harmless. It weighed almost nothing, but a hunter knows when a trap is near. Fenrir said he would only agree to be bound if one of the gods put a hand in his mouth as a promise of fairness. "If I can break it," he said, "I will let the hand go. If I cannot, I will keep my payment." Silence fell over the shore. No one stepped forward. They looked to Odin. He said nothing. Thor frowned at the water. Freya studied the thin grass at his feet. At last, Tyr moved. He had been feeding Fenrir for years. He knew the color of the wolf's eyes and the warmth of his breath. He understood that real trust sometimes bleeds. Tyr held out his right hand. Fenrir lowered his head and took the hand gently between his teeth. The other gods wrapped the ribbon around the wolf's legs, his body, his neck, and tightened it to the rocks. Fenrir pulled carefully at first and felt the ribbon bite down. He dug his claws into the earth and threw himself against it. He twisted and writhed. His rage shook the island, but the more he fought, the smoother and tighter Gleipnir became. In the end, he lay still, panting, knowing he had been trapped by something that did not look dangerous at all. His eyes turned to Tyr. Tyr did not try to pull away. He did not beg. He simply set his jaw. Fenrir bit down. The hand came away at the wrist and dropped into the heather, small and pale against the dark ground. To make sure no sudden trick could ever tear Gleipnir free, the gods fastened the ribbon to a chain called Gelgja, ran that chain to a stone named Gjörl, and then fixed it finally to a great boulder called Thornviti. They forced a sword between Fenrir's jaws, its hilt resting on his gums and the tip stuck in the roof of his mouth, so that his teeth could not meet again. Foam ran from his lips until it formed a river called Varn. Hope, people said, as if naming it that might give courage one more day. Around the wolf, grass stopped growing. The lake itself seemed to pull back from the shore. Birds would not cross that patch of sky. Only Tyr could look straight at the bound beast without flinching. He had already paid. He had kept the promise for all of them. So the danger inside Asgard's fence was finally put under a leash that no roar could break. The gods walked back to their halls like people who have done what must be done and do not want to brag about it. There was no victory feast. Evenings grew quieter. Tyr pinned his sleeve and kept his smile, but from that day on people listened more carefully when he gave judgment. Those who suffer for the peace of others are heard differently. The old laws add details, hammering memory into place like nails. They tell us it was on Lyngvi that the wolf was bound, and on Amsvartnir that the water watched without favour. They repeat the name of Gleipnir, fair to the eye and fatal to effort. They name each stone and each link, so the story can't drift away and lose its edges. Skalds know that if you tie a tale to real hills and rivers, it stays put in the mind. The wolf learned and waited. He watched the clouds. He counted the years with more patience than any shepherd. He knew he had not lost only because the gods had been clever. He had lost because he himself had asked for a pledge, and one god had given it honestly. Lessons like that are bitter. Lessons like that grow teeth. In the visions that a seeress once sold for a high price, there is a line that says that one day these bonds will fall as easily as if someone had sliced them with a single stroke. The wolf will stand, open his jaws so wide that his lower teeth scrape the ground while the upper teeth scrape the sky. Fate itself will step forward to meet him. A son will pay for a father's choices, wearing a boot made from all the bits of leather ever cut from shoes and not thrown away. But that day has not come yet. For now, the island holds. For now, the ribbon does not fray. The watchman in Asgard hears the faint sound of the sword between those jaws and knows it is not the sound of victory. It is the sound of time bought at a price. The gods still sit in judgment under the ash. They still ride out in the mornings to the roots where the Norns tend the tree. They still lay hands on shoulders and decide hard cases. Yet every feast ends with the feeling of a door shut fast on a winter night, and a wind outside that prowls along the walls, checking every latch. Binding Fenrir is not comfort. It is a delay. A promise to keep repairing the center for as long as they can. Among all the bright halls in Asgard, one shines more gently than the rest. It is whiter than new snow and as clean as a priest's hands before prayer. This is Breidablik, the broad glame, and here Baldr held court. Nothing unclean could cross its threshold. Baldr was loved not because he was the strongest, but because his presence calmed people. He was brave without cruelty, kind without weakness, the steady light in the middle of many tempers. Husband of Nanna, father of Forseti, the god who listens to both sides of a quarrel until each quietly agrees. Baldr was the bright center that kept anger from hardening into a habit. Then he started dreaming of his own death. The dreams were sharp and icy. He woke speaking names and places that made even Odin sit up straighter. He spoke of a hall beneath the roots of the world, newly swept and waiting, with a high seat prepared and a fresh-washed mead bench. He spoke of a cold smell, the smell of the place where most humans eventually go. Frigg, his mother, did not wait or hope it would pass. She gathered the gods and said she would remove the danger by taking away permission itself. Then she went out into the worlds in the way only a determined mother can. She asked oaths from fire and from water, from iron and every metal that remembers a forge, from stone and from earth, from sickness and from poison, from beasts that walk and birds that fly, from trees, vines, and every creeping thing. Each swore not to harm Baldr. When Frigg finally came home to her hall, Fenrir, and told what she had done, the whole room seemed to breathe out at once. The fear loosened its grip. Soon the safety itself became a kind of game. Out in the field before the hall, the gods made a sport of Baldr's invulnerability. They placed him in the middle and took turns throwing things at him, laughing as they tried and failed to hurt him. The spears spun in the air and simply turned aside. Stones curved and dropped at his feet as if suddenly ashamed. Swords struck his shining mailshirt and bounced away without leaving a mark. Arrows refused to bite. The hall roared with relieved laughter. For a moment, it seemed as if the worst that could be imagined had been wrapped, bound, and taken away. For a moment. Even the servants came outside to laugh and cheer, while the gods threw weapons at Baldr and watched the world itself protect him. No one thought it was pride. It felt like relief. It felt like a thank you turned into a game. But oaths are like threads. All it takes is one missed strand. Not far from Frigg's hall, Fenrir, a small mistletoe plant grew on a north-facing tree. It was pale, thin, and harmless-looking, nothing like the heavy strength of oak or yew. Frigg had walked past it once and smiled, telling herself this little thing could not possibly be dangerous. She had asked oaths from fire, iron, stone, beasts, birds, and more, but not from this shy, green child of a plant. Loki heard the whole story, sitting as a guest in her house. He had the kind of mind that can turn kindness into a weapon and make disaster look, for a moment, like a clever idea. So he changed himself into an old woman, wrapped in a shawl, and sat near Frigg the way village women sit close to the hearth when the house is busy. In a gentle, cracked voice he asked, "Has every single thing in the world sworn not to hurt Baldr?" Frigg answered honestly, "Yes, everything has promised, except for a little mistletoe. It seemed too young and weak to frighten anyone." The old woman thanked her with the smallest nod and went out, head bowed, as if touched by the story. Outside, Loki found the mistletoe on its tree. He cut it carefully. In his hands, the soft twig hardened into something sharper, light as a switch, pointed like a dart. He polished the tip on his sleeve and looked back toward the sound of laughter. The gods were playing their game again. In the field, they stood around Baldr, throwing spears and stones and axes, and watching everything miss or slide harmlessly away. Only one figure did not join in. Hertha, Baldr's blind brother, stood to the side with his staff, listening, his face drawn with loneliness. He could hear the laughter, but he could not see the circle or the joy. Loki came to him quietly. "Why don't you honor Baldr along with the others?" he asked softly. Hertha answered in a plain, tired voice, "I cannot see to aim, and I have nothing to throw, even if I could." Loki placed the mistletoe dart into his hand. "Let me guide you," he said. "You can join the game. You should share the joy, not just listen to it." It sounded exactly like kindness. Hertha agreed. Loki helped him lift his arm, lined up the aim, and whispered when to release. The dart flew straight. It struck Baldr in the chest and sank in as if his heart had been waiting for it. He fell suddenly, heavily, like a tree that has been cut deeper than the woodcutter realized. The field went silent. No one spoke as the gods rushed in. They touched him, called his name, tried to wake him. Baldr did not move. Frigg dropped to her knees and lifted his head into her lap. Odin stood like stone, his one eye as empty as winter sky. Thor's fingers dug into the short handle of his hammer until the wood creaked. Someone took Hertha's hand and saw what he still held. They understood. Loki was already gone, swallowed by the crowd. All the oaths they had gathered from the world suddenly looked different. They were not a solid law anymore. They were a loan that had been repaid, with interest, in the worst possible way. People later said the sun seemed to hesitate, that the day ended too soon and the night stayed too long. Firelight flickered in the halls, went out, was lit again, and still it felt too dark. Nanna, Baldr's wife, stood by him and changed in the way that happens only once in a life. Her face took on the shape that grief carves and never fully removes. Their son Forseti, who usually calmed quarrels with just a few gentle words, said nothing at all. In the middle of this shock and sorrow, a stubborn will rose up among the gods. This could not be the end. Not yet. Hell down below was not cruel by design. Her duty was to keep the dead, not torture them for sport. As if someone could reach her and make a fair offer, maybe Baldr could return. But someone had to ride the road to her hall first, and the dead man had to be honored properly before any bargaining could begin. Odin bent over Baldr and whispered into his ear, words no one else heard and that no poet ever claims to know. Then the gods turned to the old work, how to say farewell to a light that steadied everyone around it. The old songs say that the earth itself shivered, and that seers dreamed of a winter that would last 3 full years. Whether that is literal or just a poet's way of telling the truth is heavy enough. Baldr had died because one tiny plant was passed over, and because one clever malice had used a blind man's hand. The bright age tilted. They carried Baldr to his ship Ringhorn, the largest vessel that ever met the sea. It rested high up on rollers, too heavy to move. Many hands tried to shove it forward. It did not budge. They sent riders to call Hyrrokin, a giantess who lived in the deep woods beyond all farms. As she came riding on a wolf, using live snakes for reins. She jumped down, walked to the prow of the ship, and gave it a single push. Ringhorn shot forward so violently that the rollers sparked and the ground shook. Thor's temper flared. He raised his hammer to strike her for showing such brute strength in their grief. The other gods grabbed his arm and stopped him. This was not the moment for that kind of pride. They laid Baldr upon the deck with careful honor. Nanna saw his body in grief hit her like winter killing an orchard in one night. She fell, and her spirit left her. They placed her beside him on the ship. Odin came and laid Draupnir on the pyre, the golden ring that drops 8 new rings every 9th night, a gift for his son beyond wind and weather. Frigg sent tokens, gifts meant to soften Hel's welcome. Freya led forward the horse that had carried Baldr in peaceful days, and they laid the animal on the ship as well, with saddle and harness, so he would not walk alone in the next world. Thor lifted his hammer and blessed the pyre so that Baldr's passage would be proper and lawful. A dwarf named Litter ran in front of him. Dazed with sorrow and rage, Thor kicked him into the flames, and the dwarf died in the fire. Torches were thrown, the pitch caught. Ringhorn slid out onto the water, burning, while a black ribbon of smoke drew itself across the sky. That was how Asgard said goodbye to its brightest, but the gods still had hope of ransom. Hermother the Swift, one of Odin's sons, stepped forward and asked for Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse. He mounted, and Sleipnir ran as easily over dark sea as over earth. For 9 nights, Hermother rode through places where nothing grows and across slopes where light is only a rumor. On the 10th night, he reached the river Gjöll, beneath a sky that gave no warmth. A bridge arched over the water, glowing pale. A maiden named Mothgud stood guard and asked who thundered so loudly across her bridge. Hermother gave his name and said he was seeking Baldr. She told him the dead had passed that way the day before, and that he would find Hel's hall further north. He rode on until he came to Helgrind, the gate that most souls cross. He pressed his heels into Sleipnir's sides. The horse leapt so plainly that even the iron bars did not ring. Inside the hall, Hermother found Baldr sitting in the high seat that had appeared in his dreams. He was just as whole as he had been in life. Honor sat around him like a cloak. Hermother stayed the night. In the morning he asked Hel to let Baldr come back. Hel is bound by keeping and by balance. If everything in the world weeps for Baldr, she said, I will release him. If even one thing refuses, he stays. Hermother prepared to ride home. Baldr gave him messages for his family. Nanna sent gifts for Frigg and for Fulla. Hel placed Draupnir in Hermother's hands and told him to return the ring to Odin, proof that he had truly stood in her hall. Sleipnir leapt the gate again in a single bound, and Hermother rode back to Asgard with news and tokens. The gods sent messengers everywhere. They asked men and giants, light elves and dark elves, mountains and orvanes, rivers and beasts, trees and grass, sickness and the small biting creatures, all to mourn Baldr. And one by one they did. Stones sweated like they were crying. Trees dropped their leaves before their time. Beasts lowered their heads. The waves grew darker. Everything wept right up to the far edges of the worlds. The messengers came back along long roads, hearts lighter, believing the condition had been met. On the last day they reached a cave. Inside sat a giantess named Thirk. They begged her to shed a single tear for Baldr so that he could come home. She answered that she would weep only dry tears at his funeral, that she liked the living and the dead equally well, and that Hel could keep what she already held. No plea could move her. Those who liked riddles and suspicion said that Thirk was Loki in yet another disguise. Whether that is true or not, her refusal served his hatred. Because one voice withheld sorrow, Hel's law stood. Baldr would remain in her hall. The hope they had hung on tears froze. In Asgard's halls, the benches began to feel a chill that came from very far away. Then came the hunt for Loki. He ran from Asgard the way a sick man runs from his own reflection. He built a small house on a lonely mountain, with 4 doors so he could look out in every direction at once. During the day, he hid as a salmon in a pool at the foot of the cliff. At night, he sat by the fire and wove a net, thin and clever, to pass the time. When he saw the gods coming across the slope, he threw the net into the flames so they wouldn't see it and suspect what he planned. They entered the house and found the ash prints of a strange tool on the hearth. Kvasir, the wise one, studied the shape in the ashes and understood what it was: a net. They twisted fresh cords from the still warm ash pattern and made one of their own, then went down to the river. They cast the net above the pool and walked in a line, drawing it through the water. The fish, a bright, quick salmon, felt the danger and slipped under the net, pressing itself into the gravel. The gods weighted the bottom of the mesh and cast again. This time the salmon shot for the open water. Thor waded out, standing in the current below the falls with his hands ready. The fish tried to dart past. Thor grabbed the tail. The salmon twisted with all its strength and almost escaped, but Thor's grip held. They say that is why salmon are narrow at the tail to this day. They dragged Loki from the water and stripped away his disguise. Then they bound him and carried him to a deep, shadow-filled cave. There they set a punishment that the land itself still remembers. They took his sons, one named Nari, one named Vali. The gods turned Vali into a wolf. In a wild frenzy, Vali tore his brother apart. Then the gods took Nari's entrails and used them as cords to bind Loki to 3 great stones, one under his shoulders, one under his hips, one under his knees. When the gruesome cords hardened, they became as strong as iron. Skadi came and fixed a venomous snake above his face so that its poison would drip steadily onto his brow. Sejin, Loki's faithful wife, came and sat beside him, holding a bowl to catch the falling drops. When the bowl is full, she must stand and empty it. In that brief moment, the venom falls directly onto Loki's skin. The pain is so fierce that he twists and writhes, and the whole earth shakes. That, the old stories say, is why we have earthquakes. So Loki remained in the cave. Baldr remained in Hel's hall. Nanna remained beside him. Draupnir returned to Odin's hand. Hel kept her gates shut, backed by her own condition. All must weep, and one had refused. Asgard kept an empty seat at the high table and a grief that did not thin with time. The gods had taken the one who caused the wound and made his punishment match the size of the harm. The world learned a new sound, the quiet tap of venom into a bowl, and the sudden heavy groan of the earth when pain outruns what mercy can catch. A prophecy grew louder in the minds of those who listened. The gods had bought themselves a river of delay, but the sea that waited beyond it was still there. After Baldr's burning and after Loki's binding, the world started to lean toward its end. The signs did not scream at first. They gathered. The ash groaned more often. The Norns poured their bright water over its bark with a seriousness that made even gods fall silent when they entered the council field. In Midgard, old women woke from dreams of wolves running along the skyline. Sailors who had never feared the sea began to muffle their oars. These were the first thin ripples of a storm still far away. Then the long winter came, the one the seeress had once described for a high price. Fimbulwinter did not care about calendars. It arrived with snow from every direction and wind that cut the skin like knives. 1 year went by, and then another, and then a third, with no summer to soften them. Frost locked doors like iron. Crops failed in the dark, frozen fields. The world was still standing. But now everyone could feel which way it was slowly, steadily lining. The kindling boxes were empty, not because the forests were gone, but because no one dared cut the last living grove. Fimbulwinter had not only frozen fields and rivers, it had frozen manners. The worst wounds did not come from the cold, but from hearts that forgot they were related. Brothers took up axes against brothers. Fathers and sons dug up old insults and renamed them debts. Guests were greeted at the doorway by hands resting on knife hilts. It was as if the warmth had been drained from courtesy just as surely as it had been drained from cattle and hearths. The sky gave its own hard testimony. For ages, two wolves had chased sun and moon across the heavens, always just behind, keeping them honest. They were called Skirl and Hattie. During Fimbulwinter, they finally closed the distance. The sun dimmed and then vanished in one sharp bite. The moon followed. The stars shook in their places and went out, like sparks carried away by a hard wind. Day and night lost their names. In that deeper half-light, 3 roosters crowed. High in Asgard, on the roof of Valhalla, the golden rooster Gullinkambi shook his feathers and screamed to wake the warrior dead. Far away in Jotunheim, a redwood forest echoed to the cry of a bird named Fjalla, calling giants to arms. And down in the shadows of hell, a soot-black rooster shrieked to the countless dead who still remembered the feel of air in their lungs. The earth answered. Quakes followed quakes. Mountains split along fault lines older than any god's memory. Caverns yawned open like new mouths. Deep beneath the roots of the world, the old devourer Nithhurga worked faster at Yggdrasil's base, while Virgilmir seethed with snakes. The bonds of many things failed. From the cave of Nipperhelia, the hound Garm tore free, his howl-making whole timbers grown like ships in a storm. Out on the black lake where Fenrir had been bound, the ribbon Gleipnir, smooth as silk and stronger than iron, burst without a sound. The great wolf rose and stretched. His jaws opened so wide that his lower jaw scraped the ground and his upper jaw brushed the sky. In the ocean that rings the world, the Midgard Serpent began to move. Jormungandr's coils slid and tightened. The sea climbed its length in hills of water. Venom smoked on its tongue, and its breath rose into the air as a dark cloud that poisoned everything it touched. Then Muspelheim stepped forward, after waiting at the edge of the story since the beginning. From the south, Surtur marched with his fire giants, their armor bright like the floor of a roaring forge. In his hand, his sword burned brighter than sunlight on snow. He set his feet on the rainbow bridge and walked. Under his weight and fire, Bifrost cracked and broke away in falling pieces. From the north, a different shadow appeared. Black sails gathered on a ship no living carpenter had ever built. It was Naglfar, the nail ship, made in hell from the trimmed fingernails and toenails of the dead. At its prow stood Thrym, steering through broken ice, though some singers insist it was Loki at the oar, guiding the vessel with his old, steady treachery. The exact name at the helm is less important than the burden the ship carried. An army of the dead. Every plank groaned under the weight of those whom hell had kept along roads that never saw a sunrise. More dead marched on land behind Loki, faces white and empty. Giants left their stone halls. The frost that once served as their ally now became their bridge and their banner. Trolls, wolves, and all the rim-born creatures came to the plain that had been named long ago for this mating. Yggdrasil shook from roots to crown. The eagle high in its top branches screamed. The 4 stags that fed on its leaves stamped and ripped at bark. Down in the dark, Nidhugger clawed and chewed as if he could pull the whole tree into shadow through hunger alone. Dwarfs stood in their stone doorways and moaned in a tongue that sounds like grinding rock. In Valhalla, benches rattled and shield racks trembled as spears tapped together like hail on a roof. The Einherjar, the chosen dead who had trained every day and fallen every evening only to rise again, reached for their weapons at last. Valkyries tightened straps on their horses and armor. At the end of the broken rainbow bridge, Heimdall climbed his watchtower and lifted the horn that no one ever wanted him to blow. He put it to his mouth. The note that rolled out was old as the world tree, clear as the first water that ever ran over stone. It traveled every road, every route, every hidden path between realms, every being understood. Odin went once more to seek counsel. He rode Sleipnir to Mimir's well and bent over the water, staring into the depth where his own sacrificed eye waited and watched. He did not ask for victory. He asked to be fully awake. Then he rode back to Asgard, put on his armor black as a raven's back, and took up Gungnir, the spear that never misses. He called his sons, his fostered heroes, and all the friends of his house. Together they walked out through the Golden Gate. The field lay exactly where the songs had promised. It was called Vigrid, said to be 100 leagues across, wide enough to hold everything that now came to it. From one side the gods marched, Aesir and Vanir, the Einherjar at their heels, shields bright, spears straight, faces set. And from the other side came fire from the south, frost from the north, the sea heaving with anger from the outer rim, the serpent rising in loops as big as hills, and the wolf whose every step killed the grass. The air was so thick with omen that even brave men spoke in low voices. Some say that before the front ranks met, a last sign appeared. In the shadowed world that would come after, a hall showed itself to the living, a place called Gimle. Light poured from its doors. It was a promise from long ago, a lantern held up not to stop the battle, but to remind any who could still see that there would be something after this. On the opposite horizon, another hall stood under a roof of writhing snakes, venom dripping like rain from its rafters, a picture of what becomes of those who break oaths without shame. Between that promise and that warning, the armies advanced. The final preparations took moments that felt like entire days. Tyr checked the strap that held his empty sleeve and smiled the quiet smile that only the truly steady understand. Freya, without the good sword he had once given away for love, took up a hunting weapon instead and squared his shoulders. Thor weighed Mjolnir in his hand and drew a long breath, the way a man does who has planted both feet on bare rock. Heimdall rested his fingers on the horn that had already done its work and waited for a particular face in the enemy ranks. Vidar stood a little apart, silent, looking down at his heavy boot, the one sewn across ages from every scrap of leather men trimmed off their shoes. Honir cast his lots and read what he already feared was true. Frigg stared toward a shadow that had once been her child and spoke no word anyone could hear. Here the story almost demands a pause. Everything is in place. Winter has done its work. The wolves have swallowed the lights of the sky. The dead have left their quiet beds. The living have stepped out of their halls. The world tree shakes from root to crown. Heimdall's horn still seems to echo around the edges of hearing. All that remains is the clash that ends an age and opens the way for whatever comes after it. Then the ranks met. On the broad plain, a cold light lay on mail shirts and on horned helmets. From the side of Asgard came Aesir and Vanir with the Einherjar, the best of the dead, finally fighting the war they had trained for. And from the other side rolled frost and fire, stone and serpent, wolf and the restive armies of hell. Yggdrasil trembled overhead, and the ground beneath answered with a deep, buried drumbeat. Odin rode first. His ravens wheeled above him. His wolves ran at his stirrups. Gungnir was level in his hand, pointing straight at the largest mouth in the story. Fenrir loomed ahead, mane sparking with the remnants of the broken bridge, eyes cold as winter stars. The spear flew. The wolf came straight through it, the shaft shattered. Odin struck again, then the jaws closed. The All-Father vanished between the teeth of the wolf without a cry. For a heartbeat, it was as if the whole field missed a breath. Then Vidar moved. The silent sun stepped into the wolf's shadow and planted his thick shoe on the lower jaw, a boot built across the ages from every bit of leather mankind had ever cut away. With one hand he seized the upper jaw and pulled. Bones creaked. The throat split. In some tellings, he drives his sword into Fenrir's heart while the boot pins the jaw. Either way, the truth is the same. Vidar avenged his father and stood, blood up to his knees, and said nothing at all. Elsewhere on the field, Thor faced Jormungandr. The serpent rose in loops as high as hills, spitting black venom that hissed wherever it struck shield or stone. Thunder walked with Thor. The sky shook. The great snake's head reared up and fell, and Mjolnir met it with a blow that sent a white flash through the minds of men who were not even looking that way. The Midgard Serpent died. The sea rolled back from the far rims it had climbed. Thor took 9 steps back on ground that suddenly felt wrong under his boots. The poison had already worked its way into him. His face went pale. He fell with his hand still wrapped around Mjolnir's short handle. The hammer lay quiet beside him, as if it understood exactly what had just been spent. Tyr met Garm, the hound of hell who had broken free. The dog's pelt was stiff with rime, its breath hot as fever. They crashed together, tooth against blade, rage against resolve. Tyr, who had once given his right hand to keep a promise, now gave the rest of himself to hold the line. Garm fell and Tyr fell. Later songs say that no grass grows where they died, an agreement of sorts between courage and courage. Freya stood before Surtur with a shining weapon that was not the famous sword he had once gifted away as a bride price. He had not called that blade back, and now at the last, the lack stood beside him like another enemy. Fire flared from Surtur's sword, throwing red over Freya's face. They fought, but the giant's flame did not bend. Freya went down, and the fire did not spare him. That is his last teaching. A gift given at the right time returns as honor. A gift given foolishly returns as hunger. On another part of the field, Heimdall and Loki finally reached each other. The watchman still carried the echo of the horn in his bones. The trickster had slipped his chains when the earth shook, and had marched at the head of the dead with a calm face that no friend would wear. Their duel looked small beside wolves and serpents and burning swords, but the story insists it belongs here. They wounded each other deeply, and both fell. Their quarrel ended in silence, and the battle rolled past. Njord had returned to Vanaheim as soon as he saw the age beginning to tip. Freyja received her share of the fallen in Folkvanger, looking not only at who they were, but how they had carried their duty. Honir cast his omens and kept his feet where others slipped. Frigg watched, and if she spoke, the wind carried her words away. Above and beyond every single clash, Surtur swung his sword. Fire leapt out like packs of hounds slipping their leashes. The battlefield became a single, glowing ember. The sky split and peeled away like old bark from a dying tree. Mountains cracked open. Rivers boiled. The pillars of the world gave way. The The seas ran over the edges of the map. Bifrost was already gone. Now even the board the players stood on began to fall apart. In their stone halls, dwarfs groaned, and the stone itself began to flow around them. At the foot of Yggdrasil, the dragon bit and sap poured like sorrow. The topmost crown burned, the trunk smoked, and the leaves curled in on themselves. The three women at the well did not lift their bowls anymore. There was no bark left to heal. To the north, Naglfar scraped across the last waters and grounded on a shore that no longer remembered its own name. Atrim stood at the prow and looked out at a fire that was not sunrise. In the south, Surtur's sword swelled until it filled the sky from one horizon to the other, even if a man shut his eyes. The last cries ended. Heat took the rest. The wind rose once, as if to say a final word, and then there was no wind. In one of the oldest, bitterest stanzas, Nithhurga comes flying out of the dark, dead men in his claws and blood on his teeth, and finds nothing living left that is afraid of him. The world went under. The waves folded over it and smoothed it flat, and the fallen stars lay cold in a sky that no longer had room for maps. That is where many poets end the age. They do not look away or try to soften the picture. They simply say, everything that could burn, burned. Everything that could drown, drowned. The great game in the old house was finished. But inside the smoke and the sea, something small and stubborn was not done. A hall of light had already revealed itself to those still breathing, and a whisper had gone out that not every seed dies just because it is buried under ash. The last work of Surtur's sword was also a clearing. The final sound was not a scream, but a long, steady hiss as water met white-hot iron. In that silence, so the old singers say, something like a breath gathered. The dark remembered what dawn feels like. The smoke thinned. Ash settled over a sea as calm as someone holding their breath. Out of that stillness, something green lifted its head. A grass came first, a faint film on slopes that had been nothing but cinders. Then birch and rowan pricked the blackened ground with thin, hopeful stems. Rivers began to run again. This time they ran clear, and their sound no longer carried the taste of fear. Somewhere over a western ridge, an eagle rode the spray of a waterfall, scanning the pools below just as it had done in days so old that no human had counted them. The world had ended in fire and flood, and yet the same world, claimed, sharpened, stripped of its disguises, began to speak again. The sun rose, not the old sun the wolf had finally caught, but her daughter, just as bright, who took her mother's path as if it had always belonged to her. The poets say Sol hid the child before the chase was lost, and that when the sky opened again, the young one stepped into the harness with a calm confidence, and the chariot remembered its way. Day returned without apology. Night returned with a softer face. Time found its rhythm the way a lost bell finds its place again on a familiar neck. On the scorched hill of Ithervoll, where the name had survived even when the stones had not, a handful of survivors gathered. They were not many, they were enough. Vidar came from the place where the wolf had fallen, his thick boot heavy with a deed that would never be spoken of without someone drawing breath and holding it. Beside him stood Varli, the son born for vengeance, who had done what he was made to do and had done it cleanly. Modi and Magni arrived driving Thor's goats, the old chariot creaking in their wake, and in their hands they carried Mjolnir, the hammer that had outlived venom and thunder and its own wielder. They had found it on the quiet battlefield where Thor lay dead. Now it weighed more than a weapon. It held the weight of two futures instead of one. Honir came last, walking slowly with a staff. Those who watched him said he seemed to be listening to something far away, as if faint voices still rose from the edge of old waters. From the paths of shadow, Baldr and Hertha arrived together, no longer separated by accident and blame, but reconciled at last, freed when the old laws cracked along with almost everything else. Seeing those two brothers shoulder to shoulder steadied the air. They looked over the field where long ago they had set benches and held council. They smiled the way people smile when they come home after a hard winter and open a door they thought might not be standing anymore. In the grass they saw bright flecks, the golden playing pieces of the first days. No one had buried them. Time had only misplaced them. The earth now offered them back, as if to say, ruling is not only war and worry, play is part of it. Craft, contest, and laughter belong at the table too. The survivors laughed, and for the first time since the battle, the sound held no trace of smoke. The land itself seemed to make a new promise. Fields bore grain without the push of a plough. Ears filled without the scratch of a scythe at their throats. Fish moved through the rivers like creatures in a world that had only ever been kind. Wind came in from the sea smelling of salt instead of ash. The rough edges of the world were still there. Cliffs, storms, hard winters, but they no longer felt as if they were trying to prove a point every hour of every day. A person could walk from wood to meadow without glancing over their shoulder every few steps. Far away from gods and halls, another story had stayed hidden and small. In a thicket called Hodmimis Holt, a pair of humans had taken shelter while Surtur's sword scorched the world and the sea climbed toward the sky. Their names were Lif and Lifthrasia, life and the one who clings to life. Morning dew kept them alive when nothing else could. When the ground finally stopped shuddering and the air stopped burning, they stepped out under the new sun and did not flinch. From their hunger and their relief, humanity began again. They did not find lectures waiting for them. They found berries on bushes, cold water in a stream, and a level patch of earth where a small fire could be built, and watched, this time, with a care that remembered what wildfire can do. High above and deep below, the afterworld straightened itself. A hall called Gimle shone with its own light, not borrowed from sun or moon. It waited for the righteous, a roof under which truth felt natural rather than exhausting. On a broad plain, a hall called Brimir offered ale that never soured and companionship that did not wear thin with time. In shadowed hills rich in ore, Sindri's hall glowed for those who loved craft and steady work. But not every old house was softened by mercy. Nastrand remained, its walls woven from the flayed backs of oath-breakers. Poison still fell from those ribs like a slow, endless rain. There, the names of the treacherous were spoken out loud, and the speaking itself was a sentence. A warning was preserved beside the comforts. Yggdrasil had suffered beyond easy telling. Its trunk was charred, its crown burned, its roots chewed. But from the blackened bark, small leaves pushed through, and from its highest branches, a new whisper began to move down into a future that was just learning to count its days. The wells were still themselves. Urther remained what has been, memory. Verdandi remained the quick, blooming present, alive and fading at the same time. Skuld remained what must come, a dew that arrives quietly and still shapes the day. They tended the wounded bark with their pale clay and clear water drawn from depths that had not dried up even when the stars fell. Those who say fate was erased are not listening. Fate was not wiped out. It was repaired. Its sharp, cutting edges were smoothed, but the grain of it remained. Whenever a story offers you dawn after ruin, one question always rises. What about the old hatreds? The poems look toward the horizon and refuse to lie. They admit only this. Once Nidhugger flies again out of the dark, a corpse in his claws and blood on his teeth. Then the verses fall silent, maybe because the singer wanted to end with a small shiver, or because warning must stand beside hope if hope is to remain honest. Better to say, the new age will have its own struggles, and those struggles will be worth singing about. Odin did not walk that new morning, but his memory did. Men set a spear along the wall and said, "This is for the one who paid for truth." They did not bow to an empty space. They kept the habit of counsel, of asking hard questions before drawing steel, and that is its own kind of worship. Thor's heavy stride did not shake the new floors, but the hammer hanging from his son's belts drew a clear line around home and field. People understood that line without needing any sermon. Freyr himself was not seen at the first ploughing, but the rain arrived when it should, and the barns remembered how to fill. Baldr's high seat in Breidablik glowed again, and in his presence people spoke a little more gently, and allowed silence to do its part in every conversation. Hertha's hand rested on the rail, and no one doubted that justice could be blind and still exact. Tyr did not sit among them, but when the first lawstone was raised, his name was carved deep into it. Courage given in service of fair measure is not something ash can bury. So among ordinary people, a few old habits survived the end of the world and walked into the new one. A bride still asked for a hammer to be laid in her lap so her bed and her future would be blessed. A craftsman still cut small strokes into wood or metal, the kind of marks that turn blind chance aside just enough to let skill do its work. A sailor still poured a mouthful of ale into the river before he drank and asked the water to be a road instead of a grave. Dreams carried memories the way soil carries seeds. A skald sat by the fire and told children the old stories and refused to tidy the endings. He added one more lesson at the end. When the world ends, keep your eyes open. When the world returns, keep your word. Slowly, the place of judgment filled again. New faces learned to sit at Ithervoll and send riders out from that first route with decisions that could stand a winter's test. They agreed that a good day is one where the golden game pieces stay in their pouch because the work has gone well. A better day is one where the pieces come out and everyone has time to play. They did not chase perfection in human shape. They aimed for balance, the same goal the old gods had in mind when they poured water over the tree's bark each morning. So the world remade itself along the same hidden plan as before, but under a kinder light. Corn ripened without being weighed down by debt. Carvers and smiths worked without the constant fear of sudden ruin. A smith smiled at a clean, straight seam, knowing it would outlast his body. A widow stood at a river, spoke her dead husband's name, and did not feel hell's cold hand at her spine. A child asked, "Why does summer smell like honey?" And someone answered, "Because once a tree survived and 3 women refused to let it die." A world can die and rise again. Stories survive in another way. They live in mouths and in scratches on wood and stone. They accept the changes that years demand so their core can endure. After the ash cooled and the green came back, memory became the last great craft of the North, the one art everyone was responsible for. What follows after this rebirth is not just a list of written texts. It is a map of how a people kept their gods within reach, and how those gods, in turn, shaped the daily habits of that people. Before there was vellum, there were voices. Skalds stood in smoky halls with ice along the eaves and turned deeds into song. They taught listeners to hear a ship as sea horse, to hear gold as serpent bed, to hear blood as mead of the sword. Those kennings were not clever puzzles for their own sake. They were a discipline, a way of tying many layers of story into a single clean line. They named Bragi Bodasson as one of the first masters. They told of Egil Skallagrimsson, who carved runes to heal and to curse, then sang over them so cut and sound worked together. In that way, story and spell walked side by side without embarrassment. The runes themselves held part of the house. The elder Futhark, and later the younger, were cut into door lintels and gravestones, and amulets worn under tunics. Short pleas appear again and again. Thor Hallow. On one stone a little hammer is carved where others might have put a cross. On another, a charm curls like a small river along the edge of a memorial and promises help to anyone who reads it aloud without stumbling. These are not long myths, they are doorways. Through them, the larger stories breathe. Some scenes were pressed into thin gold foil small enough to hide in a palm. The Gullgubber showed two figures meeting in a ritual embrace. Scholars see in those tiny pictures the echo of old Vanir rites, a blessing in miniature, meant to keep field and house in good balance. Iron plates from island smithies show a one-eyed figure, a hunched trickster, a strong man holding a square-headed tool. A whetstone from Snapton carries a face with its lips sewn together, proof that fireside ash can preserve an image even when bright halls have crumbled. Stone remembered as well. The picture stones of Gotland show a man in a boat using an ox head for bait, while a serpent rises from the dark water. The Gosforth cross in northern England bears carvings of a wolf, a serpent, and a rider on a strange horse. Christian craftsmen raised that cross for their own faith, but the old fights are still there, weathered yet legible, a reminder that when people share winters, their stories share space too. Temples stood while the old worship lasted. Adam of Bremen wrote of a great house at Uppsala, its walls shining and its sacred grove thick with a fear that even strangers could feel. And from these stones, foils, runes, songs, and habits, the remade world carried its gods, not as rulers in the sky alone, but as shapes in their memory, in their laws, and in the way they lived from one winter to the next. Sacrifices were once made there in a rhythm that moved with the seasons, as natural as thaw and frost. In Iceland, a lawspeaker lay under his cloak, listening to wind and argument, and decided that one land should have one law, so that families would not go on cutting each other down forever. After that day, men could still pour out a quiet offering in a barn corner or at a sea rock where the waves come close, but the public rites were ended. One spoken law closed the old altars. The word that ended them did not end the stories. When cold and fire had finally spent themselves on the plains of myth, the burden of remembering passed to scribes. In Iceland, a long-lived island without kings, men wrote in a tongue that sounded like their own voices. On thin sheets of calfskin, a small book we now call the Codex Regius gathered poems of seers and insult feasts, of wagers with giants, and the proud speech of kings not yet born. In those leaves, the vellum itself seems to tell of long winters and high fires. You can hear Odin boasting of the spells he learned on the tree. You can hear a dwarf reeling off the names of night and day until the real dawn shows in the doorway. The book carries its own quiet marvel. It came late into our hands after years hidden. A whole section is gone, and the gap in its leaves stands like a missing plank in a familiar bridge. We cross anyway. The river still needs crossing. Another book set out to teach poets their craft and keep the old names from tangling. Snorri Sturluson, with the dry humour of a lawyer and the imagination of a skald, wrote of high one, just as high and third, as if he were only writing a friendly handbook. He explained why the sea can be called Aegir's maid, why a corpse can be called the hawk's share, why a king can be called the tree of rings. He told how Thor once lifted a cat that was more than a cat, and how he once drank from a horn that was more than a horn. He told of a giantess riding a wolf with snakes for reins, and of how she shoved a ship into the sea with a single push. He began with a story that said the gods were just men from Asia, clever talkers who dazzled the north with tricks. That opening made the bishops happy, but the rest of the book quietly refuses to forget what the people knew. It keeps the quarrels and courtesies that make a pantheon feel like a household instead of a parade. Memory does not live in ink alone. The weekdays still speak with old tongues in lands far from the fjords. Tuesday carries to the one-handed fairness that keeps bargains even when it hurts. Wednesday keeps Odin with his hunger for costly counsel. Thursday bears Thor, whose hammer once steadied barns and borders. Friday remembers a goddess of love and foresight, Freyja or Frigg, her name spelled differently in different valleys, but the warmth much the same. A place names bear witness where people have farmed the same plots for 1,000 years. Fields and groves still carry the old dedications. Freyja's sacred space, Thor's sanctuary, Odin's meadow. On a stone at Frösön, the runes name a man who raised a bridge and then say plainly that he baptized the people of the island. On that single line of text, 2 ages shake hands. Law pulls on memory and reshapes it. The old codes from the western fjords urge fairness at the thing, the assembly, yet admit, without embarrassment, that a feast for the gods once stood beside the court. Later laws forbid blood sacrifice as a public rite and levy fines on those who keep the old calendar. Even then, poets did not write to rebel, but to explain. They kept what was worth keeping. They set the tales in a past that felt safely far away, but still close enough to make a cheek flush or a spine straighten when justice is named. Heroic families carried the gods forward by echo rather than direct appearance. A dragon horde shows that greed sleeps with its eyes open. A cursed ring teaches that gifts must be measured, or they will measure you instead. A Valkyrie shows that choice has a face and a voice, and is not just the throw of blind dice. The Völsung poems do not always bring the gods on stage, yet the whole stage still belongs to them. The shape of fate in those stories is the same shape the seeress sings when she lifts her gaze from under her hood and looks across ages. Folklore kept other doors slightly open. In winter, people speak of the wild hunt that rips across the sky with dogs and riders in its wake. A tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat leads them. Children are called indoors when the wind turns a certain way. At midwinter, these days called Christmas in most mouths, old names still stir underneath the new ones. Yule fires burn. A bearded gift-bearer walks over the snow. Wise folk do not demand straight lines from lives bent by cold and hope. Our traditions fold over each other like blankets. Archaeology finds the crumbs that hands dropped without thinking. A child's wooden toy, hammered into ferry landing mud. A plaque of whalebone scratched with a little man and a coiling shape. A brooch with a ring that might be a sun, or might be a sign known only to the woman who wore it. These do not prove that any particular story really happened. They prove something else, that people carried meanings in their pockets and pinned them to their clothes because meanings are a kind of warmth. At the end of the greatest of the old poems, the seeress speaks of bright halls waiting for the worthy, and in the next breath tells of a dragon flying with corpses in his claws. She leaves us standing between promise and warning. That tension is the heart of this religion of stories. The gods are brave and fallible. They swear oaths and sometimes pay far more than they meant to. They die and they return. The world breaks and is repaired, and breaks again and must be repaired once more. The telling asks only two things of the listener: remember and act as if that memory matters. So the North remembers. On the tongue, in kennings that turn a ship into a sea stallion and a wave into a wall. On stone, in runes that bid a god to guard a traveller's path. In books copied by men who served a new altar and still loved the old craft. In place, names and weekdays and proverbs. In the hush that falls over a room when winter speaks in the chimney and everyone hears something older than the house. The story began with a gap and a drip, with a cow, a giant, and 3 brothers who built a world from the body of a threat. It pauses for now, with children stepping out of a thicket into light that belongs to them, with friends coming back from hell and smiling like men who have forgiven the night, and with a hammer once more placed carefully into a waiting hand.